Ready? Okay, so can I welcome our members, officers and the public to today's meeting of the London Assembly Transport Committee. The main item we'll be discussing today is public transport fares in London. Can I ask everyone in the room to make sure your electronic devices are switched off or on silent mode? And can I start by asking our clerk, Paul Goodchild, if any apologies have been received?
No apologies for absence, Chair, but we've got a few members who will be arriving late today. Some of the members, Desai, Sheikh and Bailey.
Great, we're just waiting for one of our guests as well. So can I ask the committee to, under declarations of interest, set out at item 2, ask if you have any other interest to declare other than what's on the papers? No? Good. Item 3 is the minutes of the last meeting. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting we held on the 14th of December 2022 to be signed by me as a correct record?
Agreed.
Thank you. All right, item 4 is our summary list of actions. Can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from the previous meetings of the committee?
Noted.
Thank you very much. So that takes us on to our main item of business, which is a question and answer session on public transport fares in London. We've got a number of guests today, and I'd like to welcome them all, apart from one who we're just waiting for, who's been held up by transport issues, to the chamber. We have Seb Dance, who is the Deputy Mayor for Transport. Thank you for joining us today. We have Shashi Verma, the Director of Strategy and Chief Technology Officer at TfL. Thank you for coming. We have Abigail Wood, who is the Chief Executive of Age UK London. Thank you for coming. Michael Roberts, who is the new Chief Executive of London TravelWatch. Welcome. We're just waiting for Norman Baker, who is the Director of External Affairs for Campaign for Better Transport. So when he gets here, we'll welcome him too. So I'm going to start with the questions. My first question is obviously going to be to Seb, the Deputy Mayor for Transport. When are you going to make a decision on whether to increase fares in London, and when would this increase likely take effect?
Thank you very much. So obviously I won't be making the decision. It will be the Mayor who'll be making the decision, and he'll be making the decision very soon. Obviously, when the funding deal was struck, there was a clause in there which gave a provision on matching the increase or decrease, indeed, theoretical, that the government might put on national rail fares. So that's one of the elements that he will have to take into consideration, but there will be a decision very soon.
Okay, so do I take it from that your advice to the Mayor has gone in, essentially, on what you think the fare rise should be?
So obviously the discussions with TfL and me and looking at the relative benefits and disadvantages of different options, obviously we're having that discussion at the moment. But as I say, the final decision hasn't been made by the Mayor yet.
Okay. Can you explain to us, because this has been a bone of contention, exactly how constrained the Mayor is by the recent government decisions?
Obviously, when you look at the travel card fares and the cap, that is obviously something that is determined by the decisions that the government make on national rail fares. So in that sense, there is very little that the Mayor can do on that aspect of fares. On the individual fares, obviously the Mayor has discretion to raise or lower fares in every part of the network. The problem being, of course, that he is tied to the agreement that the government stipulated, which is that any shortfall, as in any amount that is below the figure that the government have decided on, would have to be made up by TfL. And we have, as part of the agreement, conditions put on us by government to increase revenue, and that is one of the downsides of the necessary agreement that we signed with government back in the summer.
So am I right that within the document that you signed in the summer, this is the August 2022 funding agreement, there is an assumption that we will follow the government's increase?
Yes. So In terms of managing the budget and presenting the business plan, TfL obviously had to make an assumption on the basis of what was written into the agreement. The assumption that TfL was planning on and the basis on which the business business plan has been put forward is a 4% increase. That was the working assumption that TfL has been operating to, and of course that's another element that the Mayor has had to take into account when he makes his decision.
But the actual agreement, sticking to the agreement, involves following the government. I'm not just talking about the assumption in terms of the numbers. The government's, so to be clear, the budget that we've put forwards, the numbers at the back of the agreement make the assumption that the increase will be 4%. The government's number has been 5.9%, but there are provisions within here that say the Mayor ought to be following the government's increase on average across our fares.
Yeah, it's important to separate the assumption that was made during the business planning process, which is you're absent of any data from government, against the decision that the government took just before the new year on setting the level of fare increases for National Rail. The agreement is very clear that any shortfall between the government's announced figure and the figure that the Mayor decides on has to be, if it's lower than the National Rail figure, that has to be made up. The difference has to be made up by TfL. Now, obviously, when we're in an environment where we have additional pressures arising from the funding agreement to increase revenue, that makes it even harder to see where that wiggle room might come from.
And when you say they have to make, you would have to make up the difference, or what? What would happen at that point?
Well, potentially we could see a reduction in support from government, and obviously, as we know, the support from government has been an essential part of maintaining the network going forward. You'll have heard this many times, but TfL is uniquely dependent on fare revenue when you look at other transport authorities around the world. And because of the decrease in fare revenue over the pandemic, we have had to seek government support to make up that shortfall. So if we receive less support from government, then obviously we need to find that money elsewhere. And we've already made a number of difficult decisions on how to increase TfL's revenue. So it would make a difficult situation more difficult.
Okay. I think it's fair to say that our average fare increase overall across London is going to be 5.9% then.
Well, as I say, that's a decision that the Mayor will have to take.
I can't see there's anything else that could come out of what you just said to us, though.
Well, you could draw your own conclusions as the decision that you might make in his position, but of course he has to take into account a whole range of factors, but those are the factors that he will consider when he makes the decision.
Okay, that is a very high increase. It would be higher than we've seen in a long time. Can I ask then, you just described how the travel cards and caps are still governed by that government decision. That's because we're still within the travel card agreement.
Yes and no. I mean, Shashi will be able to go into greater detail on the mechanics behind it. But yes, when you the travel card agreement obviously determines a lot of what the cap fares will be. The cap is obviously designed to mirror the travel card's effect. When you use pay as you go and you travel over a week, the weekly cap is designed to largely mirror the travel card fare. So when the government increases National Rail fares, of course that will have an impact on the cap as well.
Okay. And then within the different TfL controlled fares, so that's, to be clear, that's tube fares, where people are only taking tube journeys, Elizabeth Line, Overground?
Yeah, broadly speaking, you define it as tube and rail and bus and tram.
Okay, great. And tram, obviously, yes. Across all of those, you are at liberty to set different levels of fare increases on different services. Are you considering that?
Obviously, the impact on different services is one of the factors that the Mayor will also consider, in addition to matching or not the fare increase that the government has set on National Rail.
And the things you'll consider there are things like what kinds of workers and people are dependent on different services. Services that potentially might need more encouragement for passengers to return as well.
Absolutely. When you take a decision like this, you have to look at all the push and pull factors. pressure that we have to increase revenue is clear. It's there written into the agreement. It's also a consequence, if you like, of the funding model that we have. But you also need to recognise the fact that increasing fares does, of course, have a downward pressure on people's willingness to and ability to travel.
Okay, thank you. I'll move on to Shashi Verma now. Thank you very much for coming. As I understand it, your job is essentially all of the fares and all of the different systems that look after the fares and charge people different amounts. Do you agree with what the Deputy Mayor just said in terms of how constrained we are in setting different fares on different services, adjusting the travel cards and that kind of thing? Are we basically still within the travel card agreement and forced to push the fares up by 5.9 across the travel cards and caps, and then slightly freer in all the rest of it?
Well, of course, I agree with Seb. I mean, the travel card agreement has been in place for a very long time, and that constrains our degree of freedom in terms of setting travel card fares. Travel card fares then translate into weekly pay-as-you-go caps on both Oyster and contactless. And since 2015, daily caps have been 1/5 of weekly caps. So travel card fares, weekly caps, and daily caps are all constrained by the need to have to agree to what the DFT does on those front. As far as individual pay-as-you-go fares are concerned, uncapped fares, the mayor has more flexibility on those, but he doesn't have that flexibility on anything that's capped or within the travel card.
And if we did withdraw from the travel card agreement, we'd have lots more flexibility to set different fares, is that right?
Well, yes and no, because you would still have the weekly caps, and the weekly caps and daily caps still need to be agreed with National Rail. So getting out of the travel card alone does not mean that you have complete freedom of action from that point on. As long as we want integrated fares between the Tube and National Rail, there will be some constraints. It comes from wanting integrated fares.
Okay, but you're freer to go negotiate what those things might be.
It'll still follow the same rules. The weekly caps and the daily caps still follow the same rules as the travel card agreement. Of course, they're bound by a very different agreement, but the fare setting process is very similar.
Okay, I'm taking my chair hat off for a moment, because one thing I've pushed as an individual assembly member is the idea that fares in outer London, particularly the zonal system, which means that fares from zone 5 and 6 into central London, where lots of Londoners work, are much higher, in fact, particularly, when it adds up over the course of a year, and that flatter fares might be a good thing. So we're prevented from doing that because it's written into the travel card agreement, am I right?
Well, look,
and this could be more flexible in future, or not?
Again, as long as you want integration with National Rail, some degree of respect for distance has to come in. Otherwise, you end up with a very big cliff edge at the boundary of London, with all the rat runs and everything else that will happen with it. Flat fares work in systems that are much smaller than ours. If you look at Paris, which has a flatter fare, if you look at New York, that has a flatter fare, geographically, they're very small systems. No one has a flat fare system on a service as large as what TfL serves.
And what would the problem be with a cliff edge?
Well, the problem is you have rat runs, for one thing. There's a question of fairness. Look, it's a matter of choice. If you wanted a flat fare, you can have a flat fare. That's not a problem. That is a matter of choice. But that's not the way fares have been done in London for the last 200 years. So that would be a very radical change from the one that we have today. And you would have to ask yourself, what purpose are you trying to fulfill by doing something of that kind? So would you charge the same fare for somebody traveling from, for example, Brixton to Victoria as you would from Chorleywood to Moorgate?
Yeah, those are, we haven't got time to go into all of those questions, but there is potentially more flexibility to do that if we're talking about changing to a new agreement with the rail companies.
You could, and then you would have all the problems with National Rail. What do you do with, for example, Finsbury Park to King's Cross, which you can do by National Rail and the Tube? What would you do with, Higher on the Hill or, Watford to Euston, which are served by two parallel lines?
Yes, that's what I mean. We need to come to an agreement with National Rail about what they would charge as well.
Well, and they would charge by distance because they're serving nationally.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that another time. Are you also thinking about more options for to reflect the different working patterns there are now through the pandemic? So more people working part-time potentially, or more people working at home more days of the week, and not wanting necessarily a weekly cap. Are you considering making any changes to that this year or in the near future?
You know, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a huge amount of discussion among transport agencies around the world about how to come up with a flexible fare structure, right? And the reality is, we have that flexible fare structure. We have had that for many years. We've had a pay-as-you-go system where you only pay for what you use. We have a system of daily capping where you get capped out at the end of the day. We have a system where the daily caps are 1/5 of the weekly caps, which means that if you only work 2 days a week, you pay for 2/5 of a week. If you work 5 days a week, you pay for the whole week. It's not clear what more we could do to support the flexible working patterns, because we've had that in place in London. The places where that demand comes through, including in the UK, is on national rail, right? And it comes through in other countries where they don't have this kind of flexibility, where you could be paying, for example, on national rail, if you travel 3 days a week, the fare that you would be paying is no different from what you would pay if you were buying a weekly. And that's where the question of flexibility in fares comes in. It does not come in London because we have that flexible fare structure, and we've had that for a very long time.
I mean, the difference is the monthly cap that you can create by buying a monthly travel card. Is that something that's slightly dying out, and therefore?
Well, look, monthlies offer a very small discount over weeklies, right? Monthlies are priced at the equivalent of 27 days. So unless you're really traveling intensely for 28 days or more in a month, a monthly travel card has very little value to you. Annual travel cards do offer value, but that's because, and there are issues with the annual travel card. But the reality is that the use of travel cards has declined by about 80% over the years that pay-as-you-go has become popular, and they've declined very significantly during the pandemic as well.
Is that all travel cards or the annual travel cards?
All travel cards, weeklies, monthlies, annuals, everything has declined.
Okay, that's really interesting. Did any members have any follow-ups on that? I think, Sean, you had a follow-up on these questions. Okay, great. I am passing over to Ellie Baker now for further questions.
Thanks, Chair, on that exciting bombshell about 80% reduction of travel cards. I don't know whether everyone else knew, but maybe I'm one of the only people who are still using one. So thanks very much for that. So Seb, next question is to Seb, which is about the research shows that increases in bus fares impact low-income Londoners the most, as well as women and people of colour. We know which groups tend to use the bus more. So previously, under the current mayor, we've actually seen a drop in the real terms price of the cheapest bus single and the bus season pass. But we are obviously looking at fare rises. We don't know what those will be yet. But what could be the impact on those groups who most use the bus if there are increases in the bus fare, and how are you seeking to manage that?
Yeah, thank you for that. So clearly, you have to look at the different demographics and patterns of ridership across all services, and it's true to say that buses are generally more used by those on lower income because, of course, they are the cheapest form of transport on the network. I should say that the bus fare is among the cheapest, not just in the UK, but in Western Europe as well. And, of course, the mayor has put it front and centre of his policy throughout his terms of office to keep the fare as low as possible, with, of course, the fares freeze before the pandemic. The subsequent agreements that have had to be made with government, as we'd said earlier, arising from the unique fare structure that revenue structure that TfL has, means that reluctantly he has had to increase the bus fare in previous announcements. But again, it's still the cheapest form of transport on the network, and with the hopper fare, of course, becomes very much more viable for making longer journeys involving changes of bus to get around the city. Clearly, any increase will have an impact on the lowest paid. and those with the least. And that's why I think it's important to recognise that the fares freeze continues to have an impact on fares now, because of course had the Mayor not introduced the fares freeze at the start of his tenure, fares now would be correspondingly much higher than they are. And of course with each subsequent agreement with the government that we would have had to have made, not that he would have known that when he introduced the fares freeze of course, the fares would have increased year on year in accordance with those agreements. So I think it's important to recognise that the ethos that the Mayor introduced at the very beginning of his tenure continues to have an impact on keeping bus fares low.
So are there, I think it's fair to say it's not just because of the level of fares that is used by the lowest payer and other groups, but it's also where the buses go. So are there other mitigations that obviously presumably there will be some rise in bus fares. Are there other mitigations that are being considered if bus fares rise in order to mitigate the impact on those groups?
Yeah, so obviously one of the hardest things that, I would say unpleasant things that I've had to do in my role as Deputy Mayor is oversee the consultation on the reduction in routes that came about as a result of the latest round of agreements with government. And obviously the scale of responses to that, indicating the real need that there is for many of those routes to be retained, demonstrates the usability and the utility of the bus network, which, as you say, reaches parts that the I'm going to use a term that Shashi will probably say is not very technical, so apologies, but the fixed elements of the network obviously can't reach. So you can be much more flexible with buses than you can with other modes of transport. And one of the things that the Mayor is committed to do is increasing the amount of bus kilometrage in outer London as well. And in conjunction with his announcement to expand ULEZ, that is another critical part of the strategy to essentially decrease the number of private car journeys and increase reliance on the public transport system and active transport as well. Clearly, bus users as well will walk to the bus stop or use some form of active transport in most cases to get to the bus stop. So increasing bus use also increases active travel as well, all contributing to the 80% target by 2041.
Thank you. So we'd like to, I'd like to open a question open to all of the panel, and when I do, I'd like to welcome Norman Baker. Thanks for joining the panel today. Apologies for the transport difficulties. So I'd like to open a question to the whole panel, which is, what would be the impact on passengers of increasing public transport fares in London? Does anyone want to come in on that very wide-ranging question? Yeah, okay. Thank you.
First of all, it's kind of you to apologise for my transport delay. I should apologise to you, I think, for being late. But I'm just in defence, I would say that I had to wait 11 minutes for a Jubilee Line train. And then when I got to Canary Wharf, the taxi driver, when I asked him to come here, took me towards Tower Bridge. I had to redirect him towards where you are now. So there we are. That's my hassle for the morning. Look, I mean, there's clear evidence that that price plays a part in people's decision making as to which form of transport they take. And that's evidence from this country, it's evidence from abroad as well. Perhaps we'll come on to what's happened in other countries, but there's been a big shift towards public transport use where fares have been cut. And indeed, there's a big shift away from public transport where fares have been increased. I mean, the price is a definite factor. Not everybody can choose. Some people have to use public transport, if you put it in those terms. Other people have a choice to whether use a car or the bus, or the tube for that matter, or heavy rail. If you look over the last 20 years, what you'll have seen, probably 30 years actually, is that the cost of travelling by bus, this is across England, but it's also true, I think, in London, has increased markedly above the cost of using your car, mainly because fuel duty has been frozen now for 12 years. It was actually cut last year. And bus fares have increased above inflation in England and in London. In London, less than England, by the way. The increase in London is a lot less than across England. I'll give you the figures if you want to have them on that. But there's a direct correlation. And this is, from our point of view as campaign for better transport bonkers, to use a technical term, in the sense that the government's got a net zero strategy, and any net zero strategy worth its weight has to be one which drives public transport use, because public transport vehicles are by definition far less polluting than private cars and private vans. And yet the incentives from the Treasury over the years have been to encourage car use and discourage public transport use. There's a study from Sweden, it's not obviously necessarily applicable here, but showing that a 1% increase in bus fares leads to a 0.2% decrease in bus use. I mean, clearly there are other factors at play in every country, but nevertheless that's an indicative analysis which shows that there is a direct correlation.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
If I could just come in there, I mean, so we have 50 years of research in London about what happens when you raise fares. And the answer is that every % of fare increase above inflation leads to a reduction of about 0.3% in demand. But I think you have to ask that question in two ways, if I could be bold enough to say this. There's a question of what happens when you raise fares. And I'll tell you, it's one of the most painful things I have to do. I mean, I have to do it every year. It's not a pleasant thing to do at all. But you also have to ask the question, what happens if you don't raise the fares? Because the system is not awash with money. The system is constrained for money. And if the answer is that if you don't have the money that comes from revenue, then it would lead to reduction in services. That is a much worse outcome than raising fares. So I don't think we can ask or answer this question without looking at both sides of this question. And that is the debate that unfortunately we have to engage in all the time. Now, if we had money, if we had the level of support that other cities get from government, then we might have a much lower fare in London than we do right now. And that is the same sort of equation that applies in Paris, in New York, in practically every other city in the world. But the public policy choice, the fiscal choice that has been made in this country, is that public transport has to be paid for by fares income. And what we see right now is the consequence of that.
Yeah, no, that is really helpful to put that in context. Absolutely. And if I could just follow up, Shashi, so obviously you're saying that along with other things, that fares rises do affect demand, but demand's also driven by a whole load of other things. Obviously, whether there are services, which is obviously crucial, population growth and the pandemic, and how have those things affected fares planning recently?
Well, again, if I look back at 50 years of research that's been done in London, in fact, someone's just written me a paper on the last 50 years of what's happened with fares and services and all that. It's a if anyone's interested, it's a gripping read. So, as I said, a 1% increase in demand. So 1% increase in fares leads to a 0.3% reduction in demand. A 1% service cut leads to something between 0.6 to 0.8% reduction in demand. So we have to be mindful of that too, right? A service cut is much worse than a fare increase, and therefore, on balance, the thing that you have to consider all the time when looking at fares decisions is how to keep the system fiscally whole, so that you're not engaging in service cuts, which are far more destructive than fare increases.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Thanks very much. Michael, did you want to come in?
Yes, thank you. And this is only week 3 of me in the role, so I'm in the interesting position that everyone around this table probably knows more about these issues than I do. But I think the straight answer to your question, what's the impact likely to be, is it will be complex. I think you have to start by understanding where we are today, and that's the result over the last 2 or 3 years of a combination of the impact of the lockdowns, the subsequent relaxation of those, and then the cost of living crisis. And you net all of that out, bus demand is back to about 83% of what was normal previously. Tube and rail ridership in London is back to a low level, about 70%. If we think about the 5.9% increase in rail fares, I mean, it's small relief to passengers that's less than the rate of inflation, which is double that, or was double that at the time that the announcement was made. But it's still a significant real terms rise at a time of enormous economic pressure on households, against a backdrop when the level of value for money that passengers perceive from rail is low. It historically has been particularly low in London and the South East, but less than 4 in 10 passengers say that they get value for money out of our rail fares, increasing them by 6% nearly. It's not going to do a lot for that. And on top of the fact that only yesterday it was reported that 40% of tube and rail services in the capital in 2022 were delayed or cancelled. So you put all of that together, 5.9% feels better than inflation, but it doesn't feel to me like it's a winning proposition either to win back customers to the railways or to improve passenger satisfaction with rail. We now move to the TfL estate. I mean, as we've heard earlier, we're yet to understand what exactly the outcome will be. The anticipated 4% originally certainly looks better than 5.9%, but it could still be the higher number. I think the impact of that will be interesting to see. I mean, to some extent, any real terms increase is probably going to consolidate the change in transport patterns that we've seen, so the move to where people are able to, working from home, at least for part of the week. But not everyone has that option. Mm-hmm. And those people in the retail sector, in hospitality, in some of our key public services like schools and hospitals, apart from the fact that they tend to be at the lower end of, often of the income scale, they have little option but where they use public transport now to continue using it. Mm. So those people are probably going to feel their household income squeezed even more, with all sorts of consequences to their well-being, potentially. We understand, I think, the points that have been made by colleagues from TfL about the balance that needs to be struck between funding improvements, keeping fares affordable, and there is this link, of course, with the national rail rise. I think if we were in the position of having to say what would we prioritise when there are tough choices to be made, I think it goes back to your point around bus fares. And so if there's any positive thing to come out of this, then prioritising bus fares for protection against increases that would otherwise be higher would be the priority, because of those users which are affected potentially by bus fare increases. And mindful also that last March bus fares went up above the level that was the average for the TfL estate. It was 6.5%. Can I make one other point, which is that rightly focus of the discussion today is about the change in fares that will be announced that will take place for the coming year. But TfL's business plan also looks out for a further 2 years. Mm. And each of those 2 years, I believe I'm right in saying, anticipates an RPI +1 increase in fares. And we're due to see the total income raised from passengers grow from 4.3 billion to 6 billion over that time. It's in the TfL business plan, and that plan explains, you know, how that is due to come. But I mean, in short, that again doesn't fill me with a lot of kind of positivity about the prospects from the point of view of the price of public transport, not just this year but over 3 years.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm going to come to Abby in a second, but I just wanted to clarify. You said 40% of tube and rail services delayed or cancelled. What's the breakdown between tube and rail?
It's rail, not tube.
It's rail, okay, yeah.
I beg your pardon.
That's fine, I just because the tube kept running, didn't it? The tube kept running, no problem. Abby, I wonder whether you could sort of outline what fares rises might do to older people in London.
So I think I don't have much to add on top of what Michael said, but I did just want to flag up, obviously all demographic groups across London are really feeling the increase in the cost of living, but that does include old Londoners, so Londoners over the age of 50. It's worth sharing that 1 in 4 currently live in poverty, and that compares to 18% for the rest of England. I also wanted to flag up that gap in poverty between those living in London and those living in the rest of the country has been steadily increasing for the past 10 years. So 10 years ago, it was 19% of older Londoners and 16% of those living elsewhere. And we've now got the 7 percentage point gap. So this is an increasing problem. And obviously the cost of living overall shapes that, but fares are an element. Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much. That's much helpful. Seb, did you have anything to add to that? No, that's fine. Thanks. Back to you, Chair. Oh, sorry.
Pardon me. I wanted to follow up one thing that Shashi Verma mentioned. You said you have a report about 50 years of fares and income and elasticities. Would you give us a copy of that so we can put it into our papers?
I'd be more than happy to do that.
I thought so.
We have someone who's retiring after 51 years of service, having done all these fares. So I asked him to write this report about everything that he'd done over his 51 years of service, and that's what it is. I'd be more than happy to share it.
That would be fantastic. We can get it into the public record then and put it into our papers as well. Thank you very much. Sean Bailey, you had a follow-up question.
Just a quick question, maybe to Seb and Shashi. We talk about growing bus usage, but is the market there? Because most people I know who use the bus use it because it's the best thing to do. There is no alternative. So is there a big group of people who could be using a bus that aren't?
In theory, yes. I mean, if you look at... so if you step back and forget what's happening like right this very moment, right? Let's look at the broader picture here. The Mayor's transport strategy has some very big targets around sustainable travel. And frankly, even if the Mayor's transport strategy didn't say that, if you look at the challenges around climate change, the challenges of having a competitive London, healthy London, etc., you would end up in the same place where you need a much higher share of walking, cycling, and public transport. A lot of that has to be picked up on buses. Now, it will require policy intervention. That's all kind of there in the Mayor's transport strategy. But the market for buses is there. It's absolutely there. It has to be supported by the right sort of policies, but the market is absolutely there to be had.
Okay, interesting. How much do we subsidise bus travel?
Well, I mean, if you look at where we are today, about a third of the cost of buses is subsidy, and about 2/3, I mean, roughly speaking, is from fares income. The subsidy level has varied from time to time, over the last 20 years. It is a little bit higher right now, partly because of the pandemic and the lower ridership that we're getting. But so is rail. I mean, rail is subsidized not just in London, it's subsidized nationally. And the question of subsidy has to be asked again. I go back to the point that I was making earlier. The level of subsidy that is offered for public transport in London is the lowest in the whole world. In the whole world.
Thank you. There's a conversation to be had about international comparisons. Now, like you made the comment that the Paris system is far smaller than ours, and but I think that's a conversation for a different time. Seb.
Thank you. Just want to add to what Shashi says. I think you also have to consider two things. Firstly, in areas where there is currently not as dense a network as there is in other parts of London, specifically in outer London, the bus is a critical part of filling that gap. And secondly, of course, the bus itself acts as a feeder into other parts of the network. So there will be a lot of routes that have been optimised to ensure that people can connect to new routes, such as the Elizabeth line, for example. So the bus is a very important part of that last mile element of an overall public and active transport experience.
And first, I get the bus to the Elizabeth line. Thank you. Back to you, Chair. Thank you.
I just wanted to follow up as well. Michael, you mentioned the TfL business plan as building in this assumption of RPI +1, and obviously the forecast for RPI is very, very high for this year, but also carries on it drops and then anyway, blah, blah. Looking at that, looking at the business plan and looking at the budget, the draft budget that's come from TfL, the overall passenger income is set to increase from 4.3 billion to nearly 6 billion by 2025-26. That suggests that they are putting quite a high inflation figure on that. That is an increase of 40% in income. Now, obviously, there's some increases there in ridership potentially that's also built in. But is that something that you're going to be working on at TravelWatch? And then I'll come back to Shashi Verma for clarification on that as well.
If I could just offer one clarification.
Can I just get Michael's very brief comment before I do that?
Course.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's what you're looking at, isn't it, when you're saying those things?
Correct. And I'd be interested to hear the clarification, because I suspect those figures are in cash terms and don't account, and they're in real terms. However, I think the simple answer to your question is this is something we're going to keep an eye on, clearly.
Yeah, I think we should as an assembly too. But also, can I get some clarification from you, Shashi, on those assumptions that lead to that?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a 40% increase in passenger income. The other income isn't going up in the same way.
I get that, but there's a big post-pandemic bounce back included within those numbers. So compared to where we are right now, which is overall income being at about 81% of 2019 levels, we're expecting to be at above 100% by 2025, 26. So, there's more than a 25% increase just in ridership.
Yeah.
That's part of that overall revenue increase. So there is, of course, an assumption there for fare increases. That has to be there in every business plan. But the bulk of that is coming from a big increase in ridership.
And can you just tell us what the assumptions are currently in terms of percentage increases in future years?
Look, we're at about 81%. We're expecting to be at about 90%.
I meant in the fares.
For the fares. Well, the fares assumption comes from the central government, right? And the assumption is that we have to take, this year was 4%, but the long-term assumption is RPI plus 1, and that is the planning assumption that we have to put into the business plan.
I know the phrase RPI plus 1. What numbers are actually being plugged in there, though, just at the moment, based on the RPI forecast?
I can get you the RPI forecast. It's at one level, it's immaterial because it'll end up being what it is, and that wherever inflation ends up being, it increases fares by that much. It also increases our cost by that much. So to some extent, the fact that there is a set of numbers in the business plan is there as a guide. It will change based upon where inflation ends up being.
Okay, but Assemblymember Baker was just talking about people on lower incomes, people in the public sector. Our incomes are not going up the same way. Londoners' incomes are not going up to match inflation at the moment. So this is obviously a worry for us as representatives of Londoners to think about.
Well, look, there's a broader problem in the economy, right, which cannot be corrected by fixing transport fares. The fact that incomes are not going up in the economy is a problem that affects everything. And we can't correct for that and adjust people's incomes by fixing fares.
Can you explain why other income isn't going up in the same way? So, other income being commercial income, congestion charging, ultra-low emission zone.
So I think that's kind of outside the purview of today's session, but I'm happy to answer it. Each of those is looked at on its own merits to see what income can be derived based on the best policies that we can have on, whether it's the ultra-low emission zone. As you will imagine, there's a big expansion going on with the ultra-low emission zone this year. That income is now baked into the business plan. It takes a lot of effort to try and get something of that kind in. Further policies are yet to be decided. And therefore, we can't bake anything further into the business plan from things like the ultra-low emission zone. The same thing is true of the congestion charge. The same thing is true of advertising or property, all of which are market dependent. So, we work very hard to try and maximize our secondary income from things like advertising and property, which are commercial income, so that fares do not have to rise. And we have one of the highest sources of income among transport agencies in terms of secondary income of that kind. We leave no stone unturned on that front. But you can only get from advertising what the market will support.
Thank you. And Michael, you wanted to add something?
Just to try and help with some of the clarification as I understand it from my reading of the business plan. So you rightly put your finger on it, 40% increase over the 3 years in terms of passenger revenue, passenger income. I think that assumes an increase in tube and rail ridership to 86%, and in bus to 91% of what had previously been the normal. It obviously includes the above inflation rises. I want to come back to that very briefly at the end of my comments. I think to be fair, the plan does anticipate growing non-passenger sources of revenue significantly, but I can't remember the figures. The other thing which struck me is that when you go back to the passenger revenue numbers, there is reference in the plan to an ambition to grow passenger demand above trend, but I don't think I've seen the detail behind that, and other things such as tackling fare evasion. So there are some headline points in there which provide some pointers, but probably worth kind of exploring, if not today, then at another session. Just on the point about above inflation fare rises, I've made the point and I've said, it doesn't feel like a great look for passengers. To be fair, I mean, this is a consequence of the current linkage between national government policy and the settlement that's made for TfL. It isn't entirely of TfL's making, that particular arrangement. And I think that's a really pertinent issue when we come back later in this session to potential reform of national fares.
Okay, thank you very much. And just to clarify, yes, the other income goes up, but then it comes down, I think, based on the fact that people start to comply with the ULEZ more. I don't think that income is guaranteed in the future. Seb, I've got one more question just quickly for you. Can you remind us of the process if you wanted to increase the congestion charge or ULEZ rate? They're not index linked at all, are they?
No, I mean, it's a decision for the mayor, but I imagine you can have to consult on.
You don't have. The mayor
Shashi knows
the mayor doesn't have to consult, but it has to go through the same process of decision making as you would have to do with. I mean, it depends upon what you're doing with the congestion charge. So the mayor has increased the congestion charge several times. There is a minimal requirement to consult, but it's not a formal consultation.
And there's no way of making that index linked or increase automatically. You've got to go through that process each time, which is why it goes up in sudden steps historically. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Assembly Member Prince, you wanted to...
Yeah, just a quick one to Shashi. Your knowledge is amazing and I'm very impressed. But you made a very bold statement that the public subsidy for TfL is the lowest in the world. What percentage of public subsidy does London receive?
So if you look at where we were prior to the pandemic, and of course the pandemic has changed things. Prior to the pandemic, we were at 72% of our income coming from fares income alone. And we were on the way to becoming financially self-sustainable on an operating basis. Yeah. And we would have been the only authority in the world to make an operating surplus in the whole world. But
what percentage subsidy do we receive? Or did we to make it before the pandemic?
72% was from fares income, 28% was subsidy.
So 20-odd%, you would say.
If you look at Paris, it's 85% subsidy.
Yeah. Have you looked at Lagos?
I haven't looked at Lagos,
well,
but
Lagos is about 4%. So when you make a bold statement like the latest in the world, then that is not correct.
Well, I can give you a
I accept it may be right in Europe, but it's certainly not correct across the whole of the world, because I'm sure I could find other countries where state subsidy is far less.
Yeah, and you should also look at the quality of the transport that's afforded in Lagos as a result of that.
But that isn't the point. You said it's the lowest percentage in the world.
No, unfortunately, it is the point. I can also give you examples where there are entirely private systems running with no government intervention, but they're not comparable systems to what we're trying to run here in London.
But there's no system comparable to London, is there? Because it's the largest in the world, isn't it? You can't have your cake and eat it, sorry.
Thank you, Assemblyman Prince. I think, Norman Baker, you wanted to come in.
Yes, I wanted to pick up on the word subsidy because it has a negative implication. And actually, these other European countries, I don't know about Lagos, but these other European countries that actually derive far less from the fare box and far more from central government are not deeply inefficient. That's not why the fares are as they are and the support is as it is. It's because the elected bodies in those countries have taken the view that the public transport network performs functions other than getting people from A to B. In other words, you have an economic function and an environmental function, and those are worth paying for. That's why you get to that stage. I also want to just pick up on fares generally. It's not immediately comparable, but I don't think we should assume that when we've talked about when fares go up, patronage can go down. It's also the case when fares go down, or say where they are, patronage can go up. There's an equation there. And if you look at what's happened in Cornwall, I know Cornwall's not quite London, is it? But Cornwall, the first 3 months of the reduced fares in Cornwall have seen 625,000 extra reduced fare tickets sold, and a recovery on bus patronage, which is way above the average for the country. So there's clearly a beneficial connection there. Again, rail's not quite the same as bus, but on the East Coast Main Line, where Lumo has introduced open access fares there, and £30 to Edinburgh and so on, actually, those have been hugely successful, but not just for Lumo. This is a key point for the Treasury, that LNER, which is the state-run railway, which competes with Lumo, has actually seen an increase because it's now seen by people, passengers generally, as a rail corridor. And therefore, LNER's figures and money has gone up, although they haven't done very much on their fares. And the reality is LNER, that on that corridor, is the only bit of the rail network which is now above pre-COVID levels, and that's because fares have gone down on Lumo. So I just want to make the point really that we shouldn't automatically assume that keeping fares low is going to have a negative impact overall. It may do, and Shashi will make the calculations, but it's possible to see an increase in patronage from either freezing fares or cutting them.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and I mean, obviously, I think in the past we've made dramatic interventions into fare costs in London, and I'm not sure they've always been revenue negative. I recall the introduction of Oyster putting a big discount on the bus fare to try and encourage us to get Oyster cards. Shashi, you were around at that point. Do you remember whether that was actually cost negative, revenue negative?
Look, I mean, you know, what Norman has said is exactly right, that when you cut fares, demand goes up. But we should remember that a 1% reduction in fares also leads only to a 0.3% increase in demand. So fares cuts are revenue negative. And that's where, you know, if fares cuts were revenue positive, we'd be cutting fares. I mean, we'd be absolutely silly not to
I was
do
asking
that.
about dramatic interventions, though, because this is what's happened in Cornwall, isn't it?
Even with dramatic interventions like bringing Oyster in, what we found is, first and foremost, that there's a fare differential that was put in between cash fares and Oyster fares, but that does not mean that there was an overall reduction in fares. So when you look at the average fares that were in place in London on rail or on bus, they did not go down that much. What did happen is a big fare differential was put in to change people's behavior from paper to Oyster. The biggest impact of Oyster was that it made transport more convenient. And we should never forget that, you know, if you want people to use public transport, convenience is a very big factor. What Oyster brought in was a huge amount of convenience, and it did lead, you know, the convenience is what led to an increase in bus and rail demand. And again, there are academic studies that have been done about that. The demand on TfL services increased by about 4% by the introduction of Oyster. When it was put on national rail, it increased demand by about 6%. These are very substantial figures when you think about the the very small level of investment that's required into smart ticketing.
Okay, that is really interesting, and also interesting to hear about Cornwall. Actually, one always assumes that the thing that's limiting use out in more sort of rural, less urban areas is services, but actually from just a price intervention to make that difference is really interesting.
Yes, I mean there are a number of factors which will lead to increased public transport use and bus use. One is price, but another one is frequency. And if you go beyond, I think Shashi will tell me 10 minutes or so on the bus, then people have to start looking at timetables and you lose some of the passengers. Another one is reliability. The idea you get on a bus and it's going to take X number of minutes and you're going to get there in the right time. One is safety of buses, which they are safe, and cleanliness and so on. The number of factors play in to what mode of transport people choose. So price is only one of those, but it's very important.
Thank you very much. Right now, handing over to Assembly Member Rogers for some more questions.
Thank you, Chair. My question, I think I'll direct to the Deputy Mayor initially. So you have actually touched on the fares freeze and the impact it had on passengers. What impact did it have on TfL's budget?
So in terms of the budget, there's a slight increase in attributable ridership as well that offsets some of the impact on the budget. But obviously, as we've been hearing, any decrease in potential fare revenue will have an impact on the budget. But I think the key thing to remember here is that TfL was on track pardon the pun, for a surplus before the pandemic hit, and it was the only integrated transport authority to be in the situation to post a surplus. So clearly the fares freeze was not having a unduly negative impact on TfL's operating budget.
Okay. There were, in the pre-pandemic, there were a number of large projects that were paused or cancelled. Presumably one reason for that was lack of funds. Was there an effect of the fares freeze on there?
So again, in terms of the overall budget of TfL, the fares freeze would have had a negligible impact on the overall budget. And as I say, TfL was due to be in surplus before the pandemic hit. There's got to be a separation between the operational costs and the capital costs. Operational costs, even under the model that TfL has, we were moving to a situation, TfL was moving to a situation where it could have covered its costs and, as I say, operated with a small surplus. But when it comes to capital projects, we will always require the support of government. And of course, we need to remember that these projects benefit not just London, but the whole country. And it's not just in relation to the economic input that London then puts into the rest of the country. It's directly related to the jobs that are available in factories and the supply chain across the country. I mean, a good example, of course, is the new facility in Goole, which will be supplying new trains for the Piccadilly line. These are really important contracts, and it shows that investment in by the government leads to significant benefits elsewhere in the country, as well as London.
So back to the fares freeze. You talked about the cumulative benefit that has sort of accrued for passengers. What about the cumulative financial impact on TfL? Has that been calculated?
So, as I said, fares would be higher now were it not for the fact that the Mayor had introduced the fares freeze at the beginning of his tenure. And the deal with government really was to replace the operational income that TfL would have had had the pandemic not struck. Now, the deal doesn't replace.
That wasn't quite my question. So you're quite right that fares would be higher because of the cumulative impact, but TfL's income would be cumulatively higher as well. So there is a flip side to that, isn't there?
Oh, of course, but I mean, it's a percentage of TfL's operating income. We're talking a very, very small number indeed. So,
which number is that?
I don't have the figure in front of me, but I'm sure we can get that.
We have been told that it's not actually being calculated. That there isn't a number. I'm sure I remember that from a previous.
With your permission, can I ask Shashi whether or not we have the figure to hand?
So, if you compare 2016 with 2020, so before the pandemic, right? There are three big effects that need to be taken into account. One is the fares freeze. By the way, this has been answered in MQs. We've been given these questions, these numbers before, so it's in the public domain. The second is the reduction in grant from government, central government. And the third is the reduction in demand as a result of the economic slowdown from 2016 onwards. The fares would have been 12% higher had the fares freeze. The fares that are within the mayor's control would have been 12% higher, and overall fares would have been 6% higher had the fares freeze not happened. So that's the benefit that's been delivered to Londoners. And the result of that is the reduction in income compared to what would have happened without the fares freeze on an ongoing basis of about 200 million a year. By comparison, the reduction in government grant was 800 million per annum. So just to put that into context, 200 million from the fares freeze, 800 million from government grant. And the loss of income from the economy not growing and therefore demand not growing is also of the order of more than $500 million. So we have to put this into context.
Of course.
One is about delivering a benefit to Londoners, which does have an impact on TfL's income, and we've been very open and honest about that. But the two other impacts absolutely overwhelm the financial impact on TfL.
Yes, I mean 200 million a year is not a negligible sum.
Neither is 800 million.
No, indeed. But that you had business rates that sort of supplemented that. But if I move on, does anyone else have any comment on the impact of either budgets or passengers of the fares freeze? We'll throw it open to the rest of the committee.
Can I make a general point, if I may, which is this is a binary discussion about the consequence, on the one hand, of fares and the impact on TfL's income. And actually, there are other factors which, if we were going to take decisions, logically, would have to be taken into account. For example, if you have more people on public transport, you get cleaner environment, you get less air pollution, you get less congestion on the roads, which helps drivers who are on the roads, which speeds up matters, speeds up journeys, and helps the economy. It cuts carbon emissions. You know, really, if you're looking at, logically, at any sort of fares policy, you need to take those externalities into account. And I'm just concerned that because of the financial hammer that TfL's under, the TfL's looking at simply fares income versus fare levels, and that's actually not to take into account the wider point. And if you look at other countries, and I don't know about Lagos, come back to Keith Brinton's point, but other countries, one of the reasons that keep fares down is because they do take those accounts of the externalities rather more than we do.
Interesting. Thank you, Chair. Back to you.
Thank you very much. So we're going to move on to talk more about concessions, rather, and other things within fares now, rather than just the fare levels. And we'll bring in more of our other guests as well to talk about this. Passing over to Keith Prince for these questions to begin with.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, this is to Seb, really. Seb, what work is TfL doing to consider modifications to travel concessions in London?
So you'll be aware of a number of options that have been put out there for increasing revenue. As I say, the pressure on TfL to increase revenue is ever present. It's a reflection both of the overall funding model that TfL has, but also obviously as a direct consequence of the deal with central government. And some of those concessions have been looked at already. So, for example, looking at the fare to Heathrow, and introducing an all-day peak for fares from Zone 1. And obviously you'll be well aware of the concessions that are available at the moment, the 60-plus travel, which have been suspended before 9 a.m. As a result, again, of the immediate pressure and demand to increase revenue that have been made from central government. The Mayor is considering whether or not to continue with that restriction from previous concessions. Should say it still represents a significant benefit to over 60 travellers compared to other parts of the country. And another measure that's being considered is changing the age eligibility for the 60-plus, so to increase that incrementally in order, again, to reduce the cost burden on TfL and to increase revenue. So there are measures that are being looked at, and of course all of those have a corresponding impact on ridership and on particular demographics. So none of these decisions are made lightly or easily, and they're all done, as I say, in the context of severe financial pressure that results as a number of different factors that have been discussed already.
Thank you. I don't want to pursue this because I think I'll be treading on the toes of Sean Bailey if I do.
No problem. I think Assemblymember Pigeon's got a supplementary before I pass to Sean.
Just to clarify, Deputy Mayor, when the restrictions were brought in on the 60-plus card and the older person's travel card, it was stated it was to ensure social distancing on public transport. It was never said it was about income generation. Do you want to just clarify that for us, please?
Sure. Social distancing is obviously a hugely important response to the pandemic, and it's always been a challenge to ensure social distancing on a network that is as heavily used as ours. It's not the only reason for introducing that. That was a key benefit, absolutely.
Yeah, but that was what was given. I mean, I don't have the quote with me,
sure.
But that was what was given at the time. And obviously, the longer it's gone on, the more many of us realise this was about revenue. But at the time and in the crisis, this is about social distancing. We're trying to reduce numbers travelling and mean it's only for key workers, those going into hospitals and so on. And that's why it was originally stated it was being brought in. Shashi, do you recall?
Yeah, there are two different things that have happened here. So in June 2020, as a result of the pandemic, we brought in the temporary restrictions, and that was for social distancing. In 2021, the government gave us a target, gave the Mayor a target to raise revenue by between £500 million to £1 billion. And we had to respond to that by looking at options for raising revenue, and that report is out there in the public as well. And that listed out a number of things that could be done on fares, on council taxes, and on road pricing. And so all three of those were being pursued, and the mayor's already increased council taxes. The ultra-low emission zone went in, not for that reason to raise revenue, but it has that impact of raising revenue. And there were a number of things that were put forward in terms of raising fares income. In fact, the 5 things that were put forward over there, that's all-day peak fare to Heathrow, which was implemented last September, the increase in the deposit for the Oyster card, which was also implemented in last September. And then there were 2 things related to the concessions. One was to make permanent the restrictions on the morning peak travel on the 60 plus and the older person's Freedom Pass. And the other was to do something with the age eligibility of the 60 plus card. Now, those 2 issues are things on which the mayor has not yet taken a decision. And when he does take a decision, that'll be, be something
my
that's announced.
My colleagues are going to ask about that, but I just wanted to put on record that the original decision was made because of social distancing.
Completely.
And since then, it's been helping your revenue, but that was the public reason given, and I just wanted that to be clear on
And just to be
record.
clear, there are 2 different things that have happened at different times. One was about social distancing, and the other is a requirement from government for the mayor to raise revenue by £500 million to £1 billion.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that clarification. Across to Assemblymember Bailey for further questions.
Thank you, Chair. Can I start with Abigail and Norman possibly on this, and then to TravelWatch, Michael, as well, and you may want to chip in at the end, Deputy Mayor. What would be the impact of reductions or withdrawals of travel concessions in London, such as the travel card, the 60 plus London Oyster card, the Freedom Pass and student Oyster photo card? What would be the impact of those things?
Can you just clarify, are we talking about, I'd be most interested in talking about the increase in the eligibility for the 60 plus card. Are we not talking about the morning suspension anymore, or is that still within
That's still part
question?
of it as well, yeah.
Okay. In which case, are you happy if I talk about the morning suspension
Yes, I
first
am.
and then eligibility afterwards? So this is something that AGK London has been speaking about since November 2020. And the impact of this was drawn to our attention by older Londoners themselves who were needing to travel during the pandemic. So we were contacted by someone working for an NHS mental health service working night shifts, who said he was first made aware that he was no longer able to use his 60 plus Oyster card when returning from a night shift at 8 a.m. in the morning. That was the first time when we started to see the impact that this was having. So I want to be clear, it obviously isn't having a blanket negative ban on Londoners over the age of 60, but it is having a very negative impact on certain groups. And I'm particularly concerned because those certain groups are groups that are also facing other vulnerabilities. So we're particularly concerned about the impact that it's having on those in low-paid work, in low-paid shift work, and obviously there's a strong correlation between the 2. We know it's quite likely that it will be women undertaking that work, quite often women from ethnic minorities. So we're seeing this change really hitting those who are already struggling financially. Of course, there are some people who, at the age of 60, simply don't need to travel in those peak times, or who are in extremely well-paid jobs with a good pension who, can afford to pay for it themselves. But it's those who are really struggling to make ends meet, who may already be working part-time, either because they have things like other caring responsibilities, or simply the burden of working in something like working in retail on a shop floor. Someone at the age of 65, that is hard physical work, and they may not be able to physically continue working full-time in that work, although they also at the same time don't meet the threshold for example, a disabled person's Freedom Pass. So it's those people in particular that we're most concerned about the impact that it's having on them. We also commissioned some research in October of last year of old Londoners to try to get more of a broad overview of the impact that this was having. So we surveyed 850 Londoners over the age of 60. We did this through a polling company, not doing it directly ourselves. We wanted to find the reasons that people routinely travelled before 9 o'clock in the morning. We were expecting to see work come up as the most frequent. It was actually travelling to attend a health appointment. That was cited by 31% of respondents. 28% said work, and 8% said for caring responsibilities. Of those who frequently travelled before 9 o'clock in the morning, 28% said that the suspension of travel concessions had prevented them from making important journeys they wanted to make. 27% said that they had to cut costs elsewhere in their budget to avoid it. And the finding that I've got to say really shocked us was 13% reported that they had had to stop work because financially it didn't add up anymore. So it's definitely having an impact.
Okay, thank you. Norman, do you have anything to add?
Well, I'm very impressed by that array of figures, and obviously any concession is removed or reduced, then clearly it's going to have an impact on people, particularly with those with low income. I think it's also worth, just from a general public transport point of view, pointing out that the alternative. Well, the alternative might be stay at home, but an alternative might not simply be the car, it might be Uber. And I think we have to bear in mind in London in particular that there's an alternative to public transport which is quite cheap, and particularly for younger people. And that's coming back to the fares point, but also coming back to the concession point, that if you end up taking away concessions, then you can also drive business away from TfL.
Okay. Michael, do you have any additional comments?
So just taking a step back first, I mean, my understanding is that there are over 20 types of concession on public transport in the capital. If you consider the basket of under 18 type concessions like the zip card, the basket of over 18 concessions, for example, for students, the two types of older person concession, whether it's the older person's freedom pass or the 60 plus Oyster, and, for example, the suite of national rail cards that can be used for rail to get discounts on rail travel in the capital. I haven't got a global figure, but the footprint of all of those concessions, I would guess, is pretty significant. So I'm informed that there are 900,000 older persons freedom pass holders. That is the one that's funded by councils rather than TfL. 370,000 60 plus Oyster cards. It sounds as if the thinking isn't necessarily to change, most or certainly not all of those concessions, but looking at change is going to impact a large number of Londoners one way or the other. We've heard specifically about the proposals relating to the 60 plus Oyster card, and I think Abigail's kind of been very eloquent in explaining the likely kind of negative impacts of baking in some of those temporary changes and indeed changing the age eligibility that was mentioned previously. I mean, all that I would add to that is that the idea that we would formalise the time before which you can't use those concessions seems counter to certainly national government's ambition to get more older people back into work. It impacts on the kind of social dimension of older people who need to get to hospital appointments, which unfortunately don't kind of respect public transport kind of timetables. Sometimes you need to travel in peak time to get to those appointments. It seems to run counter to the other half of the TfL agenda, so the bit that isn't about growing revenue and putting finances on a more sustainable footing, but is about growing passenger demand. We talked about that earlier, and the business plan anticipates trying to grow rail use by 20% over where it is now, and 10% of bus use over where it is now. So for all of those reasons, it doesn't seem like a kind of very obvious way to go. But I appreciate, TfL are trying to balance a lot of things here, as we've said before.
Just a quick question to question for you, Seb, so you can make your comment as well. Is you talked about changing the age potentially. What would that age change be to? What would be differences?
Thank you. Can I answer that as part of the?
Yes,
thank
of
you. So, Michael, thank you for your kind of picture of the landscape, if you like, of the concessions, because I think it's important that we recognise that there are a great number of concessions that operate, and a huge number of those came under severe pressure during negotiations with government, particularly when it comes to the zip card where we resisted pressure to remove it completely, and that would have had a very severe impact on younger Londoners, for whom, of course, the income profile, and accept that there will always be people that fall outside the general characteristics, and general characteristics can only go so far, but they are a necessary part of all of these decisions. Younger people have a lower income profile than those aged 60 plus, so that's one of the reasons why the Mayor reluctantly, when faced with this pressure, alighted on looking at these options for the 60 plus, and ultimately took the decision to suspend during the pandemic the ability for 60 plus to travel before 9 a.m. But Abigail, you are a tireless advocate for the impact that has on older Londoners, and we want to pay credit to you, because all of the decisions to water down any concessions have a negative impact, of course they do, on the people that use them. And I think it's a powerful case to be made for more government support in order to fulfil what I think ought to be shared objectives between certainly we at City Hall and national government. And I think a sort of more holistic approach would be better going forward. But we have to take the decisions we have to take on the basis of the circumstances we find ourselves in, and the circumstances we find ourselves in is a funding deal that does not match what we need in order to operate the network as we would want. In terms, Assembly Member Bailey, of your question on what that age profile would look like, it would be an increase in the age eligibility phased in over a certain period of time. So it would be 60, then 61, then 62. Obviously, the timing of that phasing would have an impact, corresponding impact on revenue increases to TfL, and that would be a decision that the Mayor would take into account when he makes his decision on that.
Abigail?
Thank you. There's a couple of points I wanted to come back on. One, I did just want to mention in terms of the work that HK London has been doing and the work of our supporters who feel hugely passionately about this. We have, of course, been in contact with the government as well as with you, and I think it was the action when we encouraged our supporters to email grant chaps that actually generated the most response. I think it was 45,000 emails to grant chaps urging him not to use older people's concessions as a bargaining chip. There's a couple of things that I wanted to mention I think we have flagged up before in terms of whether I understand that the Mayor is in an extremely difficult position here in terms of trying to balance the books, but it does feel at the moment that the demographic group that is paying the highest price as a result of balancing the budget is those over 60 living in London. So I would be interested to know if there were any other mitigations around this, perhaps tied into provisions returning when fare revenue increases again, or perhaps protecting the use of some concessions on bus travel as opposed to other forms of travel, simply because we know that is used by the most financially vulnerable. I can already hear in my head some of my supporters saying, do not concede on any of this, but ultimately it's the most vulnerable old Londoners that I think we do need to protect and look at that. So I'd be really keen to hear at any point if there's been any consideration of those. The other thing I wanted to flag up in relation to the increase in the age eligibility of the 60 plus Oyster card, I mean, a lot of the arguments that I made earlier apply to that as well. One area where we're particularly concerned, and HK London has sought clarification on this previously, is the corresponding impact that it would have on the bus and tram discount pass, which currently has a cut-off in terms of eligibility of the age of 60, and that's I believe it's a 50% discount for those on various out-of-work benefits. We've been trying to get reassurance that if the 60 plus Oyster card eligibility were to increase, then this concession would rise to mimic that. I just want to make sure that as a result of oversight, there wouldn't ever be a situation where Londoners aged between, for example, 60 to 65 have no concession at all that's available to them and have something taken away as they become older, and as some of them find it harder to stay in the labour market, get closer to hitting retirement age where they may be on a much lower income again.
Thank you for that, Abigail. Maybe, Shashi, maybe I can ask you a question that might help sort of move this on. What is the cost of providing each of these concessions? What's the cost?
I can give you a set of numbers. I'll have to read them out. I think just to draw a bit of context on this, because Michael said a few things and Abigail said a few things that need commenting on here. The first thing is, Michael, you said about aligning with national policy. So we should remember that you're not allowed to use your older person's English national concessionary pass anywhere in the country before 9:30. London was the only place that allowed that use in the morning peak. And we should also remember that you only become eligible for the English national concessionary card at the age of 66. Yeah. So we are the only place in the UK that offers this concession at the age of 60. So, when we think about things that are being removed, it's very painful to remove anything. So, I don't want to water that down. It is incredibly painful to remove something, and we understand fully the impact that it has on the people from whom it's being removed. So, it is not a decision that would ever be taken lightly. But you have to remember that these concessions are not available elsewhere in the country. Yeah.
Oh, yes,
and that is one of the reasons why we came under a huge amount of pressure from government. Now, we came under pressure specifically about the zip cards, just to be clear. It was less about the older person's concessions. It was about the zip card, where the national eligibility is incredibly complicated. It's about how far away you live from school and whether there's a safe route to school, and local authorities have to get in and certify all of that and all that. In London, we have a much simpler system, but it's a simpler system that works at very little additional cost. Now, if you want to, I can read out the numbers if you want, or we can provide that in writing for you. That's either way is fine. I think I'll just have to find the numbers, because I don't want to just cite these numbers off the top of my head. We do have the numbers. I will come back to that in a minute. But the broader point remains that we have a system of concessions that has been designed to work well, and they are simple to administer. Everywhere else in the country, if you apply for a zip card, you have to jump through hoops, go through all these problems before you can get hold of a child's concession. That is not the case in London, and that simplicity itself has value. There was a broader question asked earlier. What is the broader purpose of concessions? So there are two things you're trying to do with concessions. One is that there are times in the day when there is spare capacity on the network, as in mostly after the morning peak, when you can offer travel for less or indeed for free to groups who are marginalized that you would want to include into the network. And this is price discrimination theory in economics, well established. That is the design of the older person's freedom pass. And that was traditionally the design of the older person's freedom pass until the morning peak eligibility got introduced. On the flip side, if you look at the zip cards, the main purpose of the zip cards is you don't want children to be driven to school, so get them to use public transport. There was a big debate when we introduced this about whether we should have school buses, which is like a huge tradition in the US, but not here. And eventually the decision that was made, I'm going back more than 20 years here, the decision that was made is that no, actually we need children to be on public transport, integrated with everything else that's going on in society. And the long-term impact of that has been that children have grown up on public transport and carry on using public transport when they start working, which is the thing that you need. You need that behavior forming in early age, and that is what is being achieved by the young person's zip cards.
I just want to focus on the cost here. Much of what you said makes perfect sense to us all, I'm sure. But we had a conversation early on about 60 plus not being able to travel before 9 o'clock. The reason I ask about the cost is, what's the cost breakdown between the bus and the train of this? Because could the mayor be looking at just making it, okay, you can use the bus? Because as we've said, it's lower income Londoners who tend to use the bus. I think Abigail said that might be a useful tactic for people who are 60 plus. Has that been looked at? And of course, the cost would be an important part of looking at that.
Well, so to answer your question in two respects, Sean, I think, again, to give you some numbers here, if you look at buses, which is where the bulk of concessionary travel is, 20% of travel, 20% of journeys are made by children for free. 14% of journeys are made by people on the 60 plus or the Freedom Pass, also for free. And another 6% are made by students and apprentices for, and other discounts, for a hefty discount. That's 40% of all the bus journeys in London, where either a discounted fare or indeed no fare is being paid at all. So again, when we go back to questions about fare increases on buses and all that, you have to remember that the cost, the fare income from buses is being earned by the other 60% of people. By comparison, when you look at the use of concessions on rail, on the tube, it's of the order of about 4% all put together. So the use of concessions is very largely being made on buses, and that reflects the cost as well as the settlement that we do with London councils around the Freedom Pass.
That's why the chair and I are so focused on having these figures so we can make the decision. Let me ask another question to Seb then. What is the difference between nominee passes and this concession for travelling early? Because I asked the mayor if nominee passes could be modified, could be changed, and he said it's unnecessary because there's no cost. So why does it cost to have 60 plus people travel before 9, but it seems that nominee passes have no impact at all?
Well, of course, I mean, in simple terms, you're looking at the overall numbers. So we're talking about a benefit for employees of TfL as opposed to the general population of 60 plus Londoners, which is obviously much higher than the payroll on TfL. So I mean that's the simple answer, but
he used the words no cost. If there's no cost for that, why is there any cost for this?
Well, because I mean, in terms of foregone revenue from nominee passes on of employees of TfL, it's negligible compared to revenue loss from 60 plus.
Nominee passes.
No, from the nominee passes of employees, as in the passes that are given to employees, and they nominate.
But then they can distribute them beyond, can't they?
To one nominated person, yeah.
Yeah, that's beyond. So those people are not employed. I'm just trying to get to the bottom of why the mayor says there's no cost for that, and for this thing, as Norman has pointed out, and Abigail has as well, there's great social uplift.
Sure.
Why he's found the big cost here but finds no cost there.
I mean,
and in addition, as you can answer them quickly, is a modification to nominee passes. Wouldn't it just give some more money to make these concessions more viable?
I mean, sure. I mean, you could look at any change in employee benefit and say that would increase money, but we're talking about negligible amounts compared to the fare pot, if you like. But also we have to take into account that employee benefits are a key part of terms and conditions of employment.
But we're not talking about taking, that's why I use the word modification.
Sure.
We're not talking about removing nominee passes from TfL staff. We're talking about people who are not TfL staff.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
there's a real difference there.
Sure, of course there is. But again, that's also considered a key part of the package of benefits that one would receive as an employee of TfL. I mean, of course you can look at that, but that would have corresponding impacts on the attractiveness of TfL as a place to work. And in terms of the amount of revenue that would increase, it's negligible.
Yeah, but we're in a situation where every penny counts at this point.
Of course.
Assembly Member Bailey, if you're having an argument, can we pursue some questioning? Because I think there are still some data points we still need to get. I can pick up if you like.
What would be the cost? I think this is actually of extending free bus travel from under 19s to under 22s as they've done in Scotland.
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer because remember, we don't collect data on the age profile of anyone using an adult Oyster card or a contactless card. So we don't actually know how many people between the age of 19 and 22 are actually traveling on the network. But based on, quite extensive analysis of what we do know, it would be very substantial. I mean, because, when you look at the age profile of people on the buses, the 19 to 22 age profile is very heavily represented. I don't want to give a guess, just out the back of my mind, but, it would be very substantial.
Okay. Chair, I think I'll come back to you.
Yeah, just let me pick up on a few things. Also, it's 19 to 21, it's under 22s, as in, so you're adding 2 more years there. Can you give us the total cost of the other concessions for us? Just you were going to do that for us before.
I have found the numbers. So the cost of the 60 plus Oyster card is 80 million.
And that's like the net cost. I mean, we discussed how
this is the net cost.
Is that yes? Great, thank you.
The Zip Oyster photo cards for under 16s is 18 million, 18.
18. Okay, thank you.
Remember, with the under 16s, there is a statutory requirement to give free travel as well. So this is the cost of the Zip card in addition to the statutory requirement. Right? There's the 16 plus Zip Oyster photo card, which is about 22 million. There's the 18 plus student and apprentice card, which is about 26 million. There's the bus and tram discount, which was just mentioned earlier, which is 22 million. There's a job center scheme, job center plus scheme, which is about 4 million. And then there's a whole plethora of other very small concessions that add up to under £1 million.
That's excellent. Can we, I know you've read that out for us really helpfully. Can we also just get that as a table? Yeah. That would be really useful to put into our papers for next month.
Chair, so could we have some kind of understanding of what nominee passes cost?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
yes, we asked that a lot, but yeah, we can put that into the mix.
That question has been answered repeatedly through Mayor's questions.
How much does it cost?
And we've said that it costs about £7 million in terms of the cost of the travel. But I think it is worth emphasizing a point that Seb made earlier, that it is something that can be regarded as a condition of employment. And if you were to take that away, you would have to make other adjustments to people's pay. And that is why the Mayor has said...
Well, that's a debate for another time. It can be, but what we know it definitely is money being paid by the taxpayer.
Absolutely. And I think...
Assembly Member Bailey, we are definitely going to have this argument in other... during the budget.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate that.
Chair, can I just add a supplementary to one of Sean Bailey's comments earlier on? It may be useful. Ireland has introduced a 50% discount on fares for adults between 19 and 23. And therefore, it seems to me that if somebody wanted to ask the Irish government what the consequence was in terms of numbers and finance there, that may be a clue as to what might happen.
Could I come in? Sorry, just a few more points.
Okay, sorry. I'm just going to... Can you put your hands up if you're asking to speak? I think I've got Keith over here. I've got Abby over there. Is that it? So Abby first and then Keith. Thank you. Are you asking further questions on another topic? Or? No, just on concession. Okay, great. Thank you.
Just wanted to come back in relation to the points about obviously the provision in London for older people being more generous than it is elsewhere in the country, and to acknowledge that yes, it is, and I just think it's brilliant.
Can you bring your microphone closer to you?
Oh, yes, sorry, my natural volume settings are very low. I just want to say how fantastic that provision is, and how it's something that the Mayor and London should be really, really proud of, and it makes an enormous contribution to making London a more age-friendly place to be, something that the Mayor has signed up to. I just wanted to make one more time my concerns about not just the short-term impact of these changes, but the long-term impact, given that you've mentioned earlier that TfL overall was able to make a small surplus in the past while making those provisions that existed before. So what I'm concerned about partly is the long-term impact for this, that 10, 20 years down the line, when fare revenues have increased again, these additional provisions, the ability to use those cards before 9 in the morning and the 60 plus Oyster card will no longer exist. And I'd be really keen to hear some reassurance on those.
Thank you very much. Actually, Seb, I would like to put to you now 2 questions that Abby's asked indirectly to you. Partly it's because she keeps looking at you that we're not hearing her on the microphone, to be honest. So there are 2 things there that Abby's raised. The question she just asked, but also the earlier question, which was asking about the potential gap between the age limit for the bus and tram discount pass and the freedom and the over 60s Oyster or wherever it may end up. Can you give some reassurance that you've no intention of making that gap appear?
Sure. So just on the first question, you make an excellent point here. And look, the Mayor does not want and has not wanted to water down any of the concessions that are available. I mean, I hope that his record before the pandemic is illustrative enough of the regard in which he holds the concession schemes. And you make an excellent point that were we to be in a position in the future, I wouldn't want to prejudice any decision that any mayor would make on this, but were we in a position where the surplus, operating surplus returned even under the current funding model, then absolutely the mayor would want to reintroduce concessions as and when is possible. But clearly we obviously have to operate in the financial circumstances that we find ourselves. On the age gap between the bus and tram, I'm not sure I can fully answer that. There would be no intention to create an anomaly, absolutely, and the way in which the fare structure operates is that bus and tram and tube and rail are sort of seen as two distinct classes of travel, but we. It's slightly technical. If I may, can I pass just to Shashi for reassurance on that? But there would certainly be no intention to create an anomaly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming the upper limit was set to match the other concession kicking in. So just can you...
Well, that's exactly the case. It was set to be 60 because at the age of 60 you become eligible for free travel. And if something were done to change that age of eligibility, we would also do something to look at all the other concessions and the fare structure alongside that.
Okay. Excellent. Abby, quick question to you. Are you aware of anything else that goes on in terms of supporting people, maybe people looking for work and all of that, that takes account of the fact that at 60 you get this extra benefit? There might be things in other fields of life even that make that assumption that need to be looked at if this age limit is going to increase.
There's nothing that's on my radar at the moment, but it's something that the team and I will be double checking.
Great, thank you. Right, moving on. Oh no, sorry, because I'm Liver Prince. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Just for consideration, I mean, the fact that older people can't use their travel, their 60+ cards before 9 o'clock for getting to hospital and places like that, which I've seen has been quite a big issue in my borough, particularly, or both my boroughs. Could there be a consideration given to perhaps having a reduced fare for over 60s in the morning? So maybe £1, or you can't do half price on 165, I appreciate that, but a reduced fare, which again may find that there's an increase in revenue because at the moment the over 60s are not using the bus if they can avoid it before 9 o'clock. By offering a reduced fare, that might actually be an upturn in revenue. So politically, the question will be to Seb, but just whether our wonderful system that we have here of taking money would be able to actually offer a different fare for different people. So if I can ask that of Shashi first before I come to you, Seb.
Well, look, in theory, you can do what you like. You can introduce a concession at any value for anything. There's immense flexibility in the system. I think the question you would have to ask yourself is, what are you trying to achieve by that halfway house? The fact is that, as I said earlier, the mayor did not suggest making this change until he was forced to do this by the government asking him to raise revenue. If you're going to raise revenue and then you say you're going to only raise half of it, well, then you have to go and find the other half somewhere else. And it's not like these things were picked up because they were easy options, but they were picked up because they were easier than other options that were considered. So if you then say that only half the income is going to come from this, then you have to answer the question, which other harder option would you pick up to find the other half of the money?
Can I just counter that with saying actually it wouldn't actually be that, would it? Because it would be extra money on top of what you're already getting. So in fact it would be an income stream rather than a cost, because at the moment you're getting no money from anybody using the bus. There's nobody over 60 who's not paying for the bus. So you could increase the number of people using the bus before that time significantly.
I go back to the point I made earlier.
It would be worth doing a trial, wouldn't it, at least for 6 months?
I go back to the point that I've made earlier, that there is well-established data over the last 50 years about what happens when you raise or decrease fares. If there was a way of cutting fares by half and raising money, we would do it all the time. It's the same argument here.
But Seb, it's more of a political decision anyway, so I'd appreciate your thoughts on that. Well, on whether we could maybe do a 6-month trial, see what it costs.
I mean,
it would only cost about 40 million, if that.
As Shashi said, I mean, it is a reduction in revenue because you're not getting the revenue that you would from the people who are using the system, and that then necessitates very difficult decisions elsewhere. I mean, one of as I said, that we've heard that the severe pressure that the mayor came under on the zip card was resisted, and as I said, the mayor has taken the decision during the pandemic to suspend pre-9 a.m. travel, and that was not an easy decision to make, but it was perhaps the least worst of a number of very bad options that were otherwise on the table. But I should say that simplicity of the fare structure is also an important consideration that we have to take into account. If we introduce too many differentials, then we're at risk of creating a very confusing system more generally. But I should point out that when it comes to the specific issue of hospital appointments, it's a very good point. And there is a scheme that is available for the reimbursement of travel to and from NHS appointments that is still there. It's a national scheme. It's operated by the government. So that key area of concern hopefully is somewhat mitigated by the existence of that scheme.
Okay, thank you. Seb Dance, Deputy Mayor, you need to leave us at noon. Is that correct still?
Yes, but I sorry, it's in my. I wasn't aware that the committee wasn't ending at noon, but yes.
Okay, so just to remind the members there that we're going to have to make sure we've cleared up all the questions with you by then, but not all the questions to everybody else. When we let Seb go, we'll also have a comfort break. So just one more question now from Assemblymember Sheikh. Welcome today.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for not being able to join from the beginning, and hello to the panel. I believe maybe some of what I've mentioned obviously would have come out in discussions when I wasn't here, so please feel free to draw on that and integrate it into your question. I mean, for me, just even coming in on the debate that was just happening, transport as a stream of governance can't operate as a silo, can it? So the social impacts on how we create our transport infrastructure and the social impacts are a vital part of what helps us think about what's best for the transport system in London. And to that end, I wanted to ask about the case for introducing new travel concessions for particular groups such as key workers, carers and volunteers, being able to enable carers and volunteers to get to places where they create huge social benefit and huge social impact for Londoners, but also with key workers and our ability in London to retain vital workforce. So to that end, what is the capacity for introducing new travel concessions for groups like that? And Seb, I'll start with you if that's okay.
Yes, thank you. I don't think we can emphasise the point enough that there is a big social benefit to public travel, public transport, which is recognised not just in the overall target that we have of 80% of active and public transport by 2041, but in the fact that you can't just look at these things in isolation, that there are obviously corresponding benefits. Nonetheless, obviously, we have to operate a network in the financial reality in which we find it. When it comes to care leavers, there is a specific commitment that the Mayor has given on concessionary travel, and that is continuing. We are working with TfL on that, and I believe that 2024 is the date on which we hope to introduce a scheme, and yes, that commitment still stands.
That's great news. I mean, I had some follow-up questions to you, Seb, but I also just wanted to ask if anyone else from the panel wanted to come in on this point around offering concessions to other groups in Londoners and the benefit for it, and therefore pushing some of our panellists in order to continue considering it. Abby?
I just wanted to mention that older Londoners they're the demographic group most likely to volunteer, and certainly we have heard from older Londoners who had regular volunteering commitments who are feeling the impact of having to pay for that travel before 9 in the morning. I would say that at the moment for Aged Care London, our focus is on opposing the current restrictions on concessions. We aren't really thinking about, in terms of our campaigning or influencing work, pushing for any additional ones at the moment. Our focus is very much on highlighting to those making the decisions the impact that these changes would have, and also highlighting, as I have done earlier, some of the potential mitigations to try and soften the impact on the most vulnerable older Londoners. So yeah, we're not really looking at the area of new ones much, in an ideal world, but I feel we're not there.
Brilliant, thank you, Abby. If there was no one else who wanted to contribute, I might just circle back to yourself then, Seb. So you said that the commitment is for 2024. That's great news, although I think we were potentially expecting it earlier, if not March. So this was funding that I think the Mayor sort of said that he'd asked Transport for London to introduce a new travel concession which would entitle care leavers to half-price travel in London. TfL been working with the Greater London Authority and London Councils on the possible options and hopes to have the new concession in place next year, subject to funding. So I think that was said in 2022 for the anticipation of that happening this year. So am I correct in understanding that's been pushed back then?
The latest I have is spring 24.
Okay. Well, anything that we can do to help bring that forward, do let us know, and we will put the levers in place as much as we can. Seb, just to follow up even further, so in July 2021, the Mayor said that he had expected £10 to £20 million cost for the companion pass, and this meant that TfL would not be able to proceed with it in the current financial climate. Given the benefit a companion pass would bring to many thousands of Londoners, can you let me know when you would be in a position to consider it again?
Yes, sorry, just on clarification on the care leavers. So the reason for the apparent slippage in introduction is because we had to wait until we concluded the discussions with government to determine what the overall funding envelope would be. And obviously, as a part of the business plan process, we obviously now know the financial envelope in which we're operating. So that's why it's not been sooner.
And just to say, thank you for that clarification. I think it's a fantastic thing that we're introducing. So I'm really pleased that the Mayor's been pushing for that and that we will have that soon.
Sure, and it's an important, obviously, recognition of the incredibly important work that key workers and care leavers do.
Indeed.
On the companion pass, I'll have to get back to you if that's all right. I don't know the specifics on the discussions there. I don't know if Shashi has any further information on that.
Well, so several things. The companions pass, one thing, it's actually quite complicated. So we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that if you think about a disabled freedom pass, a lot of the companion passes would be with people who have a disabled freedom pass, not necessarily all of them. They don't always have the same companion, so the question is, who are you issuing the card to? So there's a lot of logistical problem in figuring out how to make a companion pass work. But there's also a funding problem that we can't introduce this while we are under government support. So that is what makes it very difficult to do anything before March 24.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And just the final question now, back to you, Seb, which is the Royal College of Nurses have concerns over the cost of transport for their members. Obviously, I've already spoken to this, as have you. Are you considering giving concessionary travel to London's emergency service staff or other key workers, such as a discount for Santander cycles?
At present, that's not part of the discussions that we specifically have. But I mean, all these things are under review, all the time. So we'll certainly take any and every request and call for concessionary travel for different groups into account. But obviously, we have a difficulty in that it's not TfL that regulates the pay of key workers. That's a government decision, and obviously as elsewhere, we will call for government to be as generous as as it's possible to be for key workers who perform such an essential role.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Seb. Thanks, Chair.
Great. And just to clarify, in terms of free travel, which people in the emergency services do get that? Am I right that it is... Sorry, in the public services, we've got Transport for London staff. Police officers can travel free even when they're not working. London Fire Brigade? No, I'm just getting out on the record. Sorry, Caroline. London Ambulance Service staff? No. Okay, so the gaps are basically at the NHS kind of level, but also within the TfL group of organisations, it's the London Fire Brigade who don't currently have them.
I mean, to be clear, the free travel that's provided is mainly within people who work directly for Transport for London or through contractors, and to the police. Other emergency services are not part of it. Other key workers are not part of it. And were we to look at a key workers concession, again, anything is possible. The question is, where is the funding going to come from for that? Right?
Oh, yeah.
And, there is a problem with the pay of key workers. But again, I go back to the point I made earlier. You can't fix a pay problem across the entire economy by looking at transport fares.
No, I mean, yeah, completely. I mean, I think there are also a lot of inconsistencies that would be very expensive to close up, but it is one, isn't it, within our current sort of the GLA and public service group of staff. There is currently some groups of staff who get lots of free travel and some who get none, and that is something.
Well, just to be clear, the police have had free travel on transport right from day dot. They've always had free travel on transport. Yeah. But no one else has had free travel on transport outside of the the people who work for Transport for London directly.
Yeah, go on. Yeah, somebody remember.
Yeah, you're right, and I understand that police officers have to show their warrant card to gain entry, but I also understand that there's an implied duty on them to actually assist if there is any incident in return for that transport. Is that right?
That is right, and that is the reason why it was established, in the 19th century.
Yeah, excellent. And you can totally see why there might be arguments for other stuff. It's not for us to have that whole argument today, but I just wanted to get on the record what the gaps were while we're being transcribed. Right, now over to Assemblymember Pigeon.
Thank you. And MOPAC pay for the police. They used to be, because the MPA used to pay for on rail they do. Because there used to be huge debates every year when we were on the police authority about could we still afford this, but it was seen as a way of making sure we kept officers in the Met rather than going outside of the Met. Interesting discussions. Now, I want to move on to talking about the travel card agreement, but I'm going to put my first question to Deputy Mayor before he disappears off. Always allow 3 hours for our meetings is my advice, Deputy Mayor. At the Budget and Performance Committee on the 4th of January, and you were there, TfL's Commissioner said that no decision has yet been made on whether TfL will withdraw from the travel card agreement. When can we expect this decision to be made?
So shortly, again, as I say, it's part of a range of measures that the Mayor's looking at, but a decision will be made very, very shortly.
So it's going to be part of the wider decision about fares for the next year and the concessions.
I can't confirm that. It might be, but I'm not sure that specific decision will. It might take longer.
Okay. The other fare decisions will be made, you say, shortly. So this week, are we expecting an announcement this week?
Shortly.
Next week?
Shortly.
I think this week. Okay, I think that sounds like this week, but we may not have the travel card as part of that. That's longer term work. Okay, that's helpful clarification. Let's move to Shashi now. Expert on all of this. Can you update us on what work is being carried out by TfL about withdrawing from the travel card agreement, so we can understand what you're looking at, what you think would be the benefits of it, and what may not be?
Well, I mean, it's an issue that we've considered for a very long time, just to be clear.
Okay.
In line with all the work that we do on looking at the fare structure, we have looked at the merits and demerits of the travel card. By the way, we are very proud of the travel card. The travel card has achieved some very good things over time. The question really now is whether it is still fit for purpose, given that we have a fantastic Oyster and contactless system with daily and weekly capping, the nature of travel has changed, and many other things have happened alongside that. So that's, this is not, it's not an idle discussion, it's done in light of what we are observing in the way people travel. There are a lot of issues with withdrawing from the travel card. I mean, it's a product that's been there for 40 years, that is well loved, well used, although used much less, but still used. There are lots of issues about if you withdraw that, how do you make certain that the people who are using that are still getting a system that is fit for the kind of use that they're making of the system. And remember that the travel card, we think of the travel card as a London product, but the travel card is also sold as an add-on to National Rail products from all around the country. So, there's that consideration to be put in place as well. So there are many things here. There's the question of fares integration with National Rail, because we clearly, there's some merit in that. There's the point about fixed price travel for a week, a month, or a year, and there's some merit in that too. There's the whole question of the form of ticket that you end up buying, and there's an issue with that. Now, I think life has moved on in quite significant respects. Especially the introduction of contactless has meant that the friction that was associated, with people coming into a mainline terminus and then having to buy a ticket to travel on the tube, a lot of that friction has gone away. And that is part of the reason why we're looking at what to do with the travel card today. There are very complicated options on all of these things, but as you will know from all the work that you've done over the years as well, we have worked very hard to keep our fare system simple, easy to understand, and easy to use. And we're not about to give up on that in the course of exiting or not exiting the travel card.
And that's really interesting because this is so complex, but from the passenger point of view, they just want a simple system that works. They don't care about the complexities and how you divide up the revenue and so on behind it. One of the challenges is for overseas visitors coming here now, because you're right, contactless has transformed things which you absolutely led the way on. But actually, if you've only got one bank card and you've got a family of 4, it's not going to work for you. So are you looking at that? That's where people may buy a travel card or several travel cards, paper-based ticketing. How are you considering that as part of this? That it's not just, likes of us who may or may not have a bank card and can use the system, but actually those who are coming as visitors?
Look, we do look at all of those issues. So first thing, we have seen cards from 180 countries used on our system.
Wow. So
this is truly a global system. It's open to people from anywhere, and really it has removed, when I say it has removed the friction from travel, that is really true. I mean, places like Heathrow or St. Pancras used to be very crowded places while people acquired an Oyster card or acquired a ticket. All of that has gone away. You don't see queues anywhere across the entire network, and certainly at places like St. Pancras, where there was a huge amount of visitor traffic coming in, there's hardly anyone at the ticket machines anymore. So it's absolutely the case that visitors are using contactless cards, and we can see that because you can see the number of new contactless cards being used at St. Pancras every day, for example. The question of multiple people, the first thing is, it is an issue that comes up very infrequently, right? It gets cited as a big issue. It's a very infrequent issue. And, I have a card in my pocket, but I also have the same card loaded up on my phone. And as far as I'm concerned, those are 2 different devices. So if a visitor was traveling with me, I could use my card and they could use my phone or vice versa. And 2 of us can travel on essentially the same account. So again, from that perspective, we have opened up the system in a very big way. It doesn't mean that all use cases are catered for, and we would look very hard at making sure that no one is left without the ability to travel. And remember, Oyster will still be there. As a backstop, Oyster is not about to go away.
Okay, that's really interesting, and I agree it comes up infrequently, but it is still a potential issue there. Norman wanted to come in on this point.
Yes, thank you, Caroline. There's no doubt that the simplicity of the Oyster system, and we heard earlier on, I think, a 4% gain when it was introduced, has been transformative, and contactless is clearly transformative as well. That's easier for people operating within the TfL immediate area. And I think the concern that we have as Campaign for Better Transport is those journeys which begin way outside London but involve travel within London, and namely therefore with a travel card quite frequently, because at the moment, bear in mind that the William Shapps Rail Review had as one of the objectives a simplification of ticketing, fares and ticketing, in the general view, which I subscribe to, that if you get that right, you can make significant increases in public transport patronage by getting the fares and ticketing system right. And that's actually easier and cheaper to do in the long run than, for example, building infrastructure. So that's a terribly important aspect of public transport. But it seems to me that the travel card performs that function all right with a paper ticket. And now, if you're travelling from, dare I say, with self-interest from Lewis or somewhere down the south coast into London, I got a travel card yesterday to come up here. It wouldn't be helpful if we ended up with a system where you have to buy a ticket from Lewis to London Victoria, and then you have to get a different ticket, albeit contactless, I use ticket in the general sense, a different sort of purchase arrangement. That's going backwards, not forwards. So we have to have a system which enables those outside London to have at least the same sort of seamless travel arrangements and ticketing terms as you do now.
Yeah, Shashi, do you want to respond to that, and then also explain to me a bit more about your thinking and the impact withdrawal could have, or what mitigations you would then put in place for people who use a mixture of rail and TfL services, whether it's from outside London or potentially within?
So I'd like to make a few different points here. The first is, go back to why this has been put up as an option. It comes from the government asking the mayor to raise revenue by $500 million to $1 billion. And I go back to the point that if you want to raise revenue, something has to happen. There is no pain-free option to raise revenue anywhere, right? If it existed, we would have used it. So there will be pain in exiting the travel card, including the sort of pain that Norman has talked about, and I fully agree with that. Now, there are two responses to that I'd like to give. The first is, it's about time that National Rail dragged themselves into the 21st century. You know, they are living with an arcane, antiquated system, which has been, you know, many people have tried reforming it, including Norman in his previous life. They really need to get on with it. The good thing that is happening on that, so that's my other point, the good thing that is happening on that is the Department for Transport has now instructed us to extend our contactless system to 250 stations in the southeast. And that is a very significant move, because that will bring the seamlessness and the ease of use of contactless to a very vast area in the southeast, including, I have to say, Norman to Lewis.
Thank you.
So, you know, the way to raise money, but also to provide the convenience, is not to remain stuck in the past. Just because people liked something in the past is not the reason that that is the right answer for the future. There are better answers available today, and that's what we need to go and implement.
Okay, and just to confirm, you did say earlier that Oyster will always remain a choice, so that's still absolutely going to be there. Great. Talk me through then, you're clearly doing a very detailed piece of work. It's not going to emerge this week with the Mayor's Fares decision. Have you conducted an equalities impact assessment yet on the impact of the withdrawal from the travel card agreement?
No, we haven't done that yet, but if the Mayor were to decide on that, a full EQIA will be done.
Okay. I mean, normally that would go alongside the decision the Mayor would make. So you mean if you progress it, what sort of savings do you think you would make from this? Have you done any sort of ballpark figures on that?
Well, again, I mean, this was in the response that we gave to the government in the end of 2021, so it's also out in the public domain. A full exit from the travel card agreement would be about an increase in revenue of about 60 million a year.
60.
There are other options available for a partial exit that could raise smaller amounts of money.
Okay. And what's the sort of timescale? When do you think you'll be able to provide this information? It is something that I... of course, the transport enthusiasts out there who email me regularly, this is one of the things that's high up there in terms of my mailbox. When do you think we might get a decision on this?
Well, as I said earlier, it's a very complicated issue. So of the 5 things that the Mayor committed to do, 2 have already been done, 2 are on his agenda for decisions. This one is far more complicated, which is why it's taking time. We will make all the information available when that information's with us. But, you know, that some of this is still under progress.
Yes, it's active work. No, I'm understanding that, and I've no doubt the complexities of it. Are we talking 6 months, 3 months?
I can't offer you a timeline because...
This calendar year?
I can't offer you a timeline because
that's... mayoral term? Anything?
I really can't offer you a timeline because it is detailed work and contingent upon discussions with the Mayor, but also discussions that we need to do with the train industry.
Yeah, okay. What sort of innovation in fares do you think could come about if you did go ahead and withdraw from the travel card arrangements?
Well, look, you know, I think the issue is not so much the withdrawal from the travel card agreement. The bigger innovation in fares is going to come from extending contactless into the southeast. You know, removing something is not innovation. Producing something new is innovation, and that's what we need to do with contactless. The things that we have got used to in London, pay as you go, completely seamless. You don't need to buy a ticket in advance. You don't need to commit money in advance. The benefit of capping, the benefit of best value, where the system is always charging you the right fare. These are things that are not available to people outside London, and that is what needs to become available. That is what we are working on with putting contactless in the southeast.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. In terms of, you've already started talking about national. It's fine, Deputy Mayor. See you soon. The national rail fares reform, all these discussions that we have been looking at, and we've had discussions about Great British Railways, what does that mean, and fare simplification, all that comes through that. How might any reform of national rail fares impact the structure for fares in London?
If you look at the London fare structure, and you ask the question, well, could it be improved? It's not easy to see how it could be improved. Could it be made different? Yes, it can always be made different. You can have flat fares, you can have a lot of different things. But it's very difficult to see how you could improve on the fare structure that we have in London. I think the biggest impact from National Rail adopting contactless is that this boundary problem that we have today, which is very often at the mainline terminus stations, will go away. And that would be a huge benefit to everyone.
And is that actively being discussed as part? And are you part of the discussions at the DFT and with the rail companies?
As I mentioned earlier, we have now been instructed by the DFT to extend contactless into the southeast. We are actively working with the DFT on that. The fares are entirely a decision for them, but the fares are so intertwined with the form of ticketing that, of course, we are involved in it.
Really good, thank you. TravelWatch, Michael, do you want to comment on how national rail reform might and fares reform might impact on London? Any thoughts you have on that?
So I think this committee and many other commentators on transport have opined rightly on the shortcomings of the kind of national rail fares approach and structure. Going back a little bit to first principles, I mean, it strikes me that with regard to how reform of what at the moment is a very imperfect system, Shashi rightly highlights the kind of antiquated nature of some of this. I think there are some kind of obvious things which strike me. I mean, first of all, 45% roughly of fares in the system are regulated directly by national government, rail fares, directly regulated by government. A significant part of those are season tickets, and season tickets are a big part of the commuter market into London. So that's an obvious way in which the current system impacts on London, and reform potentially might change that. This link between a national government decision on, use the shorthand RPI +1, clearly also has a material bearing on London, given the linkage with the funding settlement for the Mayor and TfL. And at a more kind of mundane technical level, the fact that on some routes within the TfL boundary, as it were, you have both National Rail and TfL Oyster fares available for the same routes. And there's a question about the extent to which there is clarity about which of those offers the best value for the passenger who's faced with that choice. So there are a number of ways, kind of like theoretical and practical, where there's an interaction, as well as the point that Shashi has made about boundaries. From my perspective, again, keeping this fairly kind of strategic at this point, rail reform is something we at London TravelWatch are very, very keen to see. And I think there are a number of things that should happen in the interest of trying to promote a fairer, more affordable fare system that delivers better value for money. One thing is that the industry, the national rail industry, needs to reduce its cost base, because ultimately the whole issue about how much revenue is being raised is in part driven by the cost incurred by the industry to deliver services. This incidentally is an agenda as well as for TfL, and TfL in its business plan has set out ambitions for saving costs. But unless one deals with the cost base, then in general terms, there is going to be a challenge in terms of fares being affordable. So that's point one. Point two, I think there needs to be clarity by government and others around the future of above inflation fare rises. There is a theory behind it, which is, what is the right balance between passengers and taxpayers in funding the cost of the railways? And to some extent, that's a false delineation, because passengers pay taxes, generally speaking, as well. But I think in the midst of time, Treasury has said we want to see passengers shouldering a greater share of the cost of running the railways, and that's what has driven the long-term above-inflation fare rise, at what point is the right balance reached? I don't think I've seen anything which says what the right point is, but until that is clarified and there is honesty from policymakers with passengers, there will always be that temptation to think passengers are being milked. I think this is a material issue as well for London, because as the point was made by the Deputy Mayor and I think by Shashi, if we think about just things like the Tube, for example, where Londoners are already paying, one of the largest shares of the costs of providing that service, then to be faced with the prospect where we're being asked to pay, a larger share, an increasingly larger share of the cost of running the national railways as it relates in London, it just brings the point as well. Third thing is that to the extent that it's possible, given all the other pressures financially that TfL is funding, rail reform needs to ensure that we retain, at the very least, the range of concessions and discounts which are currently available. And I think to Abby's point, just simply making sure that that is preserved as far as we can, let alone thinking about new ones, is pretty important. And then finally, in terms of reform, again, this is a bit more mundane, but it needs to address what passengers perceive as the inconsistencies and unfairnesses in the system. So there are commuter journeys of similar distance within London and South East, but where the prices are significantly different. And I think from a passenger's point of view, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. There are other kind of arcane issues. Stansted Airport, for example, is, I think, the only London airport which currently isn't on the pay-as-you-go system. That catches some people out who end up paying penalty fares, and so on. Lots of little things of this sort, as well as the much higher order stuff that I mentioned before. So those four big things would be the things I think national rail reform needs to address, and which in turn, if addressed in the right way, could benefit London passengers.
Lovely, thank you. Right, I've seen Assemblymember Garrett.
Morning, afternoon. I'd like to follow up on this business about contactless, Shashi, if I may, and the discussion you were having with Assemblymember Pigeon, because there's I think, an apparently subtle but I think quite fundamental change with contactless. So this is the card I used to get here this morning. That's not the card that I used to buy my ticket. That card is literally my ticket, which seems a subtle difference, but it means that you can't then use that to buy other tickets. And I want you were speaking about the desire to have a sort of seamless ability to use public transport, which I think is by and large being true. To give you a specific scenario, my family came to visit over Christmas. They'd paid to come and visit, so it was my treat to take them out somewhere. If we all get in my car and drive, I can pay the cost. If I'd ordered up a cab from a well-known app, I can pay the cost. If half a dozen of us all go and get on the bus, I can't pay the cost for my family going. They all end up having to tap their own card and pay their own cost. And I was a bit concerned that you sort of dismissed that. I mean, I suppose it is a niche scenario. Not many Londoners come and stay with me at Christmas. But I can't be the only person who has, dependence on other people that I'd like to pay for their travel. And what's the use scenario in the contactless model that will allow someone to do that?
As I mentioned, one, people have multiple cards, and two, they can have multiple devices linked to the same card, and that's the way out. But to answer your question more comprehensively, this question comes up more in assembly hearings than from customers, really, to be honest. But to be clear, there is a reason why that policy of one person, one card exists. We have a system of touch in and touch out, and we have a system of capping. And you can't have that and multiple people traveling on the same card, because otherwise, are you charging for one person?
I understand the logic of that, and so the only solution would be to be able to buy a ticket, wouldn't it?
Yes. Which you can. You can buy any number of Oyster cards. Our Oyster cards are still available. If you want to pay for other people's travel, you can get any number of Oyster cards you want. You can buy any number of tickets you want. All of those options are available.
So the seamless plan seems to me to be that I have a drawer full of Oyster cards.
Well,
let me give you a different scenario, which is more concerning than my Christmas arrangements, which I appreciate are niche. So there was a news story of there was a teenage girl who got on a bus, for whatever reason was not able to pay for her fare, and there was a woman passenger on the bus, so she was potentially being turned off. The woman on the bus wanted to pay for this completely unrelated girl who got on the bus, but was not able to because her card she'd already used, that was her ticket. So what's the use scenario there? And I appreciate, you know, people having 17 different cards and phones and things with cards loaded onto them. You know, with respect, that's a complication, not a simplification. What's the scenario there where somebody sees somebody needs says, I'm happy to pay for that person's ticket, but they apparently cannot do that?
Well, I mean, if you have multiple cards, you can. But I go back to the point. This is a matter of choice. You can either have a very simple system like New York where you know, it's single fares, all flat fares, no capping, no nothing. You can pay for any number of people you want. Or you can have the benefit of the system that we have in London today that allows for things like capping, but you can't have both.
So the answer is
and
that girl is a rounding error in the problem of the overall system.
And to answer your question about seamlessness and the ease of use and all that, 130 million cards have been used on our system. About 60% of journeys that are being made on the underground today are on contactless cards.
So I'm conscious of time. I don't dispute that it's a really seamless system for the vast majority of people. I'm concerned that as we squeeze out the people who aren't already using that system, it leaves people stuck. So in that scenario on the bus, you know, if I'm there and I see this girl who's going to get kicked off the bus and I say, I'm going to pay for her ticket, how do I pay for her ticket? Let's assume I haven't got a portfolio of cards in my pocket, which I haven't.
It's very clear. You can't pay for that. Absolutely, you can't pay for that. If the person is vulnerable, there is already a vulnerable user policy where the driver will not evict the customer from the bus. But in other cases, yes, you need to either get an Oyster card or get another means of payment. The system cannot cater for every possible scenario, especially scenarios of that kind. But the fact that it's easy to use is attested to by the fact that it's being used by 60% of all of the people who are traveling on the network.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I think it's really helpful to get those particular use cases discussed, actually, and whether there might be other mitigations other than abandoning the plan. I think we might explore that further in future. Assemblymember McCartney.
Thank you. I'm very glad to see that Department of Transport is still talking to TfL about a system, a nationwide system, and I'm assuming they're looking at the TfL method, given that they've asked you to extend it to 250 stations. But can I just take, for example, Norman's case, coming from Lewis? At the moment, on National Rail, you get significantly cheaper tickets if you book well in advance. And often, tickets on the day are extremely expensive. And obviously, a cashless system operates on tapping and tapping out on the day. So when you're extending it to the south west, how are you planning to overcome that problem? I mean, when I travel abroad, for example, there is not that great differential between advance tickets in many cities and tickets on the day.
Well, the 2 points on that one. You know, one is that any pay-as-you-go system will be on the basis of touch in and touch out, and there'll be the fare that's charged on the day. We've shown that it has immense benefit in London. There's no doubt about that. And other systems in the world have also shown that. The question of whether there should be yield management, which is what you're talking about on National Rail, I think is a very involved question and with dubious merits. It's asserted on National Rail that it has huge value, but it's a very questionable value for essentially commuter routes. You know, when you start talking about real long-distance travel, you know, which is all pre-planned, pre-booked and all that, I think there is a difference there. There's a lot of complexity in National Rail fares and in people's understanding of National Rail fares because of yield management for what I would argue is very dubious gains. And what we have seen, again, I go back to 50 years of research on our system, what we have seen is that if you simplify fares to the point where they're understandable and they are trusted, and I emphasize both of those points, understandable and trusted, people are more likely to use the public transport system. So that is how you fill up the system.
Yeah. So TfL's been instructed to put this into 250 stations. And have you had discussions about the range of National Rail fares there? Because it'll only work if I know that I can turn up and go on the day and I'm going to get the cheapest price.
Yeah. Just to be clear, you know, what pay-as-you-go will do is replace turn-up-and-go fares. If National Rail want to add on top of that advanced fares and all that, that's entirely up to them.
Okay, fine. Norman, you wanted to come in on that?
Yes, I mean, if you look at the situation on extending 250 extra stations, that's also, just to be clear, the government's policy is to do that for urban centres across England, Manchester, Birmingham and everything else, and their concept is to have islands and bridges, as they call it, so that big urban centres are islands where you have this sort of rollout of contacts or something else, and then you have bridges which are by and large intercity routes which have a different arrangement, and that's how they want to progress it. I'm not entirely with Shashi on one matter, I am with most things, but on one matter, which is yield management, because I do actually think that has a value, and the reason why you can get from Lewis to London for £5 sometimes is because you're going at a time when nobody else really wants to travel, and the whole concept there was to try to provide reduced fares for times when there's spare capacity on the network. That was the concept, and that's why you don't have these reduced fares in the rush hour. I suppose in terms of the rollout of 250 stations, you wouldn't end up with a worse situation in that scenario, because an advance ticket by definition is only to a London terminus, and you don't have to buy a separate ticket onwards on the tube or the bus in that scenario. So unlike a travel card, and just last point on that, by the way, coming back to travel cards, is I hope that if the travel card is going to go, and I accept that you can't have something there forever just for the sake of it, that it wouldn't go before the replacement or system of 250 stations is actually there, so nobody loses out in the interim.
Thank you. Then can I move on to innovation in fares policies? And I just want to pick up on the Oyster.
Apologies, Assemblymember McCartney.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask members if we were expecting to take a comfort break at noon.
No, let's carry on.
Well, how do people feel about that? We might finish a bit earlier if we carry on.
Yeah.
Great, okay. Just to check, because it's important.
According to my briefing, I want to ask you about, you've said Oyster will always be there, but I understand that TfL launched a tender with a contract notice for revenue capture services last November, Project Proteus, asking for proof of concept. And as part of that, it said the contract would actually include the decommissioning of the legacy Oyster system. So I'm just asking for some clarification. What timescales would we be looking at?
Yeah. So just to be clear, there's no conflict between those two statements.
Okay.
The issue here is that an Oyster system will always be there. The technology behind today's Oyster card is 25 years old, right? There are not that many IT systems that you will see around the world that are 25 years old and work this well.
Okay.
And this
So
is
it's
a real,
about the back office
this is a
function,
real
the
marvel.
technology.
I mean, everything, the card, the back office, everything will need to change because this is quite old technology. But the principle that an Oyster card product that we provide will always be there is absolutely immutable.
Okay, thank you. Then looking to the future, and we may have covered this already in part, but what technological innovations regarding fares are on the horizon, and particularly what discussions are you having with other cities? Is there anything that you look at that you like, or is everyone still looking at London?
Well, so the question is about innovation in fares, and this question about innovation in ticketing. I mean, as far as ticketing is concerned, we are miles ahead of anyone else.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody else is trying to emulate what we've done. And in fact, if you look at large cities, I mean, there's small cities that have contactless systems, but if you look at large cities around the world, the first big one that went live is Sydney, and the next one that's going live right now is New York. But the rest of the world has still to adopt contactless payments alone, let alone talk about anything more futuristic than this. It's very hard to see what you would do to improve upon the user experience that contactless is providing. There isn't an emerging technology out there, and by the way, we look at all these emerging technologies. We have, I mean, contactless was our invention. This was not provided by the market. We created it ourselves. But we look at all the technologies that are possible, and it's not clear that there's anything on the horizon that would improve the user experience. As far as innovation in fares is concerned, I make the same point that I made earlier, that we've been fine-tuning our fares for 40 years now, starting with the creation of zones in 1981. Again, it's very difficult to see what you do with fares to make it better. You can always make it different. That's not an issue. It's very hard to see what you could do to make it better.
Okay, fine. And can I ask also, and you touched on this a little earlier, Shashi, that in other parts of the world, to increase ridership following COVID, central governments provided levels of subsidy and fares have substantially reduced. Did the government ever have discussions with you about that, or did TfL make representations about that?
I think, where we are is in a very different state. I mean, the first thing I should acknowledge is the government have given us about £6 billion of support through the pandemic, without which the transport system would not have survived. So, we don't want to come across as being ungrateful at all about the support that we've had from government. But the support has not extended to the point where that would have enabled us to cut fares. Quite to the opposite, as I said earlier, the mayor is being asked to raise revenue, including from fares. So the pressure on fares is in the opposite direction. But that is not to negate the fact that we have had support from government.
Thank you. And Norman, you raised this earlier.
Yeah.
Is it something that you've been asking government to do, and what has been their response?
Well, I've been trying to persuade the Treasury that it didn't necessarily mean less income if fares go down. I don't say that in a general sense, because, I mean, you have to look at individual routes. But I gave the example earlier on the East Coast Main Line, where actually revenue from LNER for the government has gone up as a consequence of fares going down. So they have to allow that possibility in their calculations. And I'm just looking at what's happened in Germany. In Germany, which of course they had a massive decrease in costs. I think it was €9, I think, for the ticket in Germany. That found that in just the first week, train trips of between 100 kilometres and 300 kilometres increased by 46% above pre-COVID levels. And there was a decline in car congestion, resulting in improved driving times in 23 out of 24 German cities, and an increased ridership of 10 to 15% in public transport. So, there is absolutely clearly evidence that there are social and environmental benefits from reductions in fares. And come back to the point I made earlier on, those matters are not taken into account because of the pressures on budgets in a way that I think would be helpful if they did. But I can give you other examples where reductions in fares, and it's very localised. You have to look at each case and its merits, because it doesn't always work. But reductions in fares have led to an increase in passengers. One small example, I persuaded Southern to reduce the season tickets between Eastbourne and Lewis, because there was spare capacity, and Lewis is in the centre of white-collar employment. To shut me up, I think they reduced the fares by a third on season tickets, and they came back rather shamefacedly some months later and said, we've made a profit on that because the ridership's gone up so much, we've actually made money on it. And in the meantime, the congestion on the parallel road, the A27, had decreased. So it cost the public purse nothing, it cost Southern nothing, and it reduced congestion on the roads. What's not to like about that? So I just think we have to have those options available and look at those on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
I just wanted to do one follow-up, and I think potentially there are other Assembly members who might want to come in at this point. Looking at Assembly Member Garrett, who indicated earlier. But I'll ask my question meanwhile. Okay, great. I'll ask my question then. Shashi, you said earlier contactless was our invention. From what I know about business, which is not a great deal, but someone who makes an innovation that is then used billions of times can make money out of that invention. Has there been any effort by TfL to license or make a royalty on contactless technology of any kind?
So our system has been licensed. In fact, the implementation that's being done in New York is on our license. We made £6 million out of that deal. So, it has been licensed several times. We've made about £22 million. I think it's important to remember how this innovation came about. London is a huge center for fintech. This is by far the biggest fintech product that has been produced in the world. There's nothing that compares to this. But the only way to get adoption on contactless was to keep all the standards open. Everything about contactless is on open standards. All the transaction models, the commercial models, the risk models, the security models, everything is open. And that was the only way to get the global banking industry to adopt this. You have to remember, the banking industry did not see the potential of micropayments back then. We had to kind of drag them along on that journey. And we couldn't have done that if the first step in that process was licensing.
So it's our gift to the world.
It is. And unfortunately, I have to say, not celebrated enough.
No. Yeah, open standards is a really good thing. Thank you very much. And yeah, we'll move on to the next section now, which is Nick Rogers again. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So this question is to the non-TfL members of the panel. Start perhaps with you, Norman. So what innovations in fares policies do you want to see applied in London? I think we're thinking of sort of some of the international examples like T-Money in Seoul, which is the distance-based pricing. You've mentioned the €9 train fares in Germany. Any other kind of fares policy innovations you'd like to see?
I've got to say, I think with due respect to TfL and the Mayor and everybody else, I think the system in London works pretty well. And I think the zones which were brought in AT1 are extremely clear, and people understand exactly what they're doing. And one of the great benefits people in London have, and I don't think this is celebrated enough either, as a matter of fact, is that people don't question what they're paying. They tap on and tap off, and they assume automatically they're paying the right fare, which they are. And I think that's very rare. I mean, I'm slightly weird, because I prefer to use Oysterling toilet atlas. I like to see what's been deducted. Not that I don't trust the system, I just want to see how much I'm spending. But I mean, but I absolutely trust that I'm being charged the right fare. So I think you don't tamper with things too much when they're working quite well. I mean, there's an issue about the level of fares. We talked about that already today. I won't go back over that. I think the real problem of fares is for London, is the interaction with National Rail. That's a real problem to sort out, and nationally it's a National Rail situation. The fares in National Rail and the structure haven't been changed for decades, by and large. And some of it's privatisation, some of it's pre-privatisation. For example, we've still got this ludicrous cliff edge at 9:30 in the morning, when you quite often see, and this affects people coming into London and therefore London services, you see that the first train, the last train before 9:30 is not particularly busy, and the first off-peak train is packed to the gunwales. That is a very poor use of rolling stock, and it really is. And also the concentration on that is out of line with the change in working patterns, because we're now seeing people working from home, we're seeing people working odd hours. Employers are being much more flexible about things. That kind of idea that the rush hour still exists is deteriorating. And also the Treasury's idea they can just bang up fares every year on the railways and people will pay is not borne out by fact. In fact, the information I had was that one of the last fare increases on the railways didn't actually reach very much money at all, because people went off the railways. It used to be the case people were trapped, commuters were trapped 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, by whatever fare was being charged. Now they just don't travel, or they do something else. So the whole world's changed in that sense. So there's the cliff edge there at 9:30. There's the issue of single leg pricing on the National Rail, because you've got the ludicrous situation, which is steeped in legislation, I think, that the cheap day return is there, which is an innovative product, but the single on the same journey is about the same price as the return. That doesn't make any sense at all. And there are all these inconsistencies in National Rail funding. So I would say, London's by and large okay, except when it interfaces with the National Rail.
Interesting, thank you. Michael, anything to add on sort of innovative fares policies?
So I think there's a strong link between fare reform, different fare structures, and technology, because the latter is really important in facilitating the former. Passengers want simplicity. We've said that many times when it comes to fares, but also passengers quite appreciate a bit of tailoring the fare system to meet their needs. So go back to what I said earlier, there are 20 plus types of concession in the London area when it comes to using transport. Each of those concessions is geared to whether it's age related or employment status related, they're each geared to try and meet the particular needs of segments of the passenger community. Now those two things, simplicity and a bit of tailoring, theoretically or potentially could be in tension with each other. Technology can help you overcome that, and that is in essence a large part of the Oyster story, and one of the reasons why we were very much pushing for a couple of years ago, I can't take any credit for it, the extension of Oyster Pay as you go to more of the South East rail estate, and Shashi's already talked about the work that is in progress there. In terms of what might be possible in terms of fares change in London and the South East, One thing that is interesting is the pilot in Scotland at the moment, the 6-month pilot, to remove peak fares entirely. Be interesting to see what the results of that are. By the way, I'm not necessarily advocating that that is the right move for London, but just understanding the lessons from that are interesting, would be interesting. I mean, potentially a less extreme version of that would be to look at whether the current daily approach to peak off-peak, so at the moment is Monday to Friday peak, you know, is that kind of in the best interest of passengers, given not least the change in working patterns in and around the capital? I think that's worthy of investigation. There are clearly going to be there could be revenue impacts from that, with all the consequences that we've talked about, so those need to be understood. Another option touches on Norman's point. We have a cliff edge, peak versus off-peak. With technology, there should be the potential to think about shoulder peak, so just as you get to the peak, you know, can you actually start to vary prices? The complexity of all of that wouldn't necessarily be something that the passenger has to deal with at the front end, because the back end systems potentially are dealing with that. Flexible seasons. I actually travel in to work using a flexible season at the moment. I actually catch my National Rail train outside of the TfL kind of area. Is the discount that's offered, basically I get 8 trips in 28 days for the price of 7, so 12.5% discount. Is that discount big enough to kind of encourage people to be coming back into London to work, to generate wealth, and so on and so forth? Again, potentially worth exploring, and so on. So I think none of this stuff is conceptually rocket science. It's essentially around tweaking an existing system. Technology potentially can help that. There will always be ramifications, not least in revenue terms. It's interesting to see that in Scotland, I think the 6-month pilot is going to cost the Scottish Government over 100 million to kind of support the train companies in implementing that, which I think plays to some of the points that Shashi's been making. But what I think is interesting is the willingness of the public sector to support experimentation. Now, it may be that the result of that experimentation is a judgment that that's not the right way to go. But unless you try, how do you know? Yeah. And passengers, as a consequence, may be missing out. The economy may be missing out. So I think a willingness, whether it's London government or whether it's national government, to stand behind the financial consequences of experimentation seems to me a critical part of this picture.
I think that's an interesting response. I mean, it does seem with the change in working patterns, we know anecdotally, but also borne out in TfL data, that Fridays, for example, are, they're barely peak. You can't really call them peak. So I wonder if, going back to Norman's point, whether there's something on fares one could do just on Fridays even, and that's experimentation, isn't it?
I think that's. I'm in touch with. We're doing a lot of work on fares and ticketing with GBR and others. If GBR actually comes into being, we don't know definitively that's going to happen yet. And there is consideration of what's happening on Mondays and Fridays, which are less busy days now than midweek, and not just in terms of fares, by the way, but also in terms of frequencies. Do you have to have the same frequency for a train on a Friday as you do on a Wednesday? You probably don't. So, you know, we need to look at things in modern. You must respond to what people are doing rather than, you know, trying to impose upon them a system they don't want.
I'll put that question, I'm conscious of time now, to Abigail. Any innovations in fares policies that you would like to see in London?
Nothing particular, but while we're talking about this, I'm aware that a lot of the innovations being discussed don't necessarily change the experience of the passenger buying a ticket. They're able to buy it in the way that they have always done it before. But I feel like this is the moment just to flag up it's not an enormous proportion, but there is a proportion of older Londoners who primarily use cash or who do not use the internet, and just making sure that the needs of that specific group aren't entirely forgotten about within this. To give you a sense of the scale, there's 200,000 Londoners over the age of 75 who've never used the internet. So just making sure that they are not entirely forgotten about in this.
That is a large number. Was that, Michael, was that the point that you were also going to make? Or?
Yeah, I was just beating me to the point that in the rush towards technology as a solution to all our problems, we need to remember that there are parts of society that find the use of technology, I mean, digital, yes, but not just, that for whom these would be these issues might be challenges. So over 250,000 Londoners don't have a bank account. That poses some challenges. Not everyone is comfortable using mobile devices, certainly on the move, and therefore to access some of the opportunities that we've been talking about. No spoilers, but we've actually been researching the issue of, in particular, digital disadvantage and exclusion. Mm-hmm. And stay tuned, but we'll be reporting on that in a couple of months' time in terms of, the scale to which with which that is an issue in the capital, and potentially some of the issues that need to be done to kind of address that.
Thank you. Look forward to that with interest. And my final question, what benefits could a more integrated ticketing system provide to Londoners? And I think we had Sylvia from Campaign for Better Transport speak to us about that in May, so maybe start with you on that one, please, Norman.
Well, I hope I give the same answer as Sylvia on that basis. Any integration is going to be beneficial. People value simplicity, as we've said around the table, and they value predictability and confidence in the system which they've got. Think about going in a car. When you go from a car from A to B, you are using one ticket, inverted commas. That's all you do. And there's something wrong with the public transport system if you have to pay again, and if you go from a bus to a tube to National Rail or to a tram, it should be one ticket, in inverted commas, for the journey you want to make from A to B. And the challenge for the public transport world is to try to secure that. Bear in mind that the providers of those services are different, because heavy rail doesn't interact very well with bus, does it? But you have to somehow link those systems up, and that's not been done. There's no reason why it shouldn't be done. But even in London, which has, thanks to Caroline and her colleagues, a hopper bus now, where you can go from one bus to another, which is a great thing to do. But even in London, you can't go from bus to tube without paying again. Okay, there's a cap for the day, but you still have to pay again. So, the other day I got on a bus in Bayswater and then changed to a tube. And if I'd actually walked about 100 metres, I could have got on the tube from Queensway and paid a lot less. That cannot be right. You should be able to move from one system to another without the inconvenience of having to get another ticket and without having to pay more. So there's a lot to be done in that integration across modes, and that's a real challenge. Now, that's happening to some extent in the West Midlands and in Manchester as well. It's not going fast enough, but it needs to do that. I'm quite impressed by Birmingham. Actually, the West Midlands has gone quite a long way in some ways further than London in integration across modes. But that I think is where I'd like to see progress made.
Thank you. You'll be pleased to see you're quite on the same page with Sylvia. Michael, Abigail, anything to add on integrated ticketing? No, excellent. Well, I'll hand it back to you, Chair. Thank you.
So, somebody with a pigeon would like to come in for a quick question before we move on.
Yeah, I'd made a note. I wanted to pick up the end from our discussion about peak, off-peak fares that we've talked about, and whether the shoulder and all that issue. Is this something, Shashi, you were looking at as you look at future structures in London? Because actually you could have a longer peak period. You could have early bird fares, half price for 7:30 in the morning. I think that was a policy somewhere a few elections ago. But that there are things you could be doing to encourage the travel at those less busy times. Is that something because you could look at that? You could, Singapore for their congestion charging. They vary every 6 months or something, the hours, based on when the congestion is in that period. You could look at the same. When is it really busy? Is that something you're considering?
So a few things here. The question of could you have shoulder peak fares? The answer is yes, you could have shoulder peak fares. I think it's a much bigger issue on National Rail than it is on the Tube. The system has the flexibility to do shoulder peak if we wanted to do it. Early bird fares, as you know well, could you make a case for it? Yes, but it comes with a loss of revenue. So there's a question there about how do you then recover the loss of revenue. So all of these issues, these choices are available. One of the things you've got to be careful about is that everyone can think about more tweaks to the system. Every tweak introduces complexity to the system. And one of the goals and one of the reasons why the system is so popular is that it's easy to understand and easy to trust. So you have to look at all of these things because they're conflicting objectives. But I have to correct one misimpression that many people have, not just here, but many people have just broadly, that the peak has disappeared. That is not the case. The peak is still the peak, especially Tuesdays to Thursdays. It is exactly what it used to be before. Just because the tube is running at 82% of traffic of 2019, it looks emptier and people think the rush hour has gone away. But the shape of the peak is still there.
But are you looking at, okay, so take out some of those extra complexities. Are you looking at whether you might change the hours of peak and off-peak and the days that they operate on?
Well, you know, like with many other things, we look at this as well, right? The question is to what end? What is the merit of doing that? Because first and foremost, keep in mind that the peak is still there, and the peak is still what it used to be, so it's not clear what problem we're trying to address by changing the peak hours. The second thing is peak hours are coordinated with National Rail. And you know, if we started doing something in TfL, you then have to look at what happens to National Rail fares, because what you don't want to end up with is in an integrated structure, different peak hours, where a journey, again, I go back to Euston to Watford, you know, if you take the tube, it's one fare. If you take National Rail, it's a different fare. So, you know, that's a complexity that we don't need. And at the end of the day, you know, it's worth pointing out that were we doing true peak pricing, right, as in to manage demand, the peak fare would be eye-wateringly high.
Yes, yes.
Right? The objective of peak and off-peak fares today is not to do that kind of demand management. It is just recognition of the fact that there are times of the day when the tube is busier or the system is busier, and there are times of the day when it's not, and therefore there is a higher and lower fare. But it is not true peak pricing as economics would justify, because the social consequences of doing that are very poor.
Okay, thank you.
Assemblymember Bailey, you wanted to ask something quick?
I think Shashi's partially answered my question, because when you talk about the concept of peak, it seems to me, do TfL generate the peak, or does the world generate the peak, if you see what I mean? Because we all travel when we travel because we have to travel at that time. If you change your peak pricing, it doesn't change the fact that I have to be at work at 9 o'clock. So would it actually do anything other than A, probably annoy people, or B, change your revenue income?
Well, I think that's exactly the point, that people, you know, everyone would like a comfortable ride, and they know, I mean, everybody knows if you travel half an hour earlier or later, you can get a more comfortable ride. And yet they arrive at the tube at 8 in the morning because they have other things to do in their life as well. Traveling to work is not the only thing. You've got to take care of children, look after all the other things, which is why people travel at the times that they do. And to add to that, the people with the least flexibility in their time of travel are usually on the lowest income. It's people like us in suits who have flexibility in our time of travel. You know, if you work for a coffee shop that's got to open at 8 o'clock in the morning, well, that's when you've got to be there. And that's why we've got to be very careful in fares at looking at social consequences of everything that we do.
Thank you very much. Okay, so for our final question, Assemblymember Prince.
Thank you, Chair. I think some of this has been touched on, but I think Michael touched on it actually. Out in the sticks, as I would call it respectfully, they have the approach. It's sort of a carnet. It's a system they use in Brussels, where you buy a package of tickets. I've still got some Brussels tickets actually, and that allows you to make so many journeys. Is that something that TfL have looked at, especially with the now new flexible working? People used to come into work Monday to Friday, so you'd buy a weekly ticket which basically gave you free weekend travel. But now you're only maybe working 2 or 3 days a week, same as Michael was referring to. It might be better if you could buy a package of 5 tickets at a discount that you could then use over a 2-week or 3-week period. Is that something you've looked at?
So we used to have a carnet. We had a carnet that was introduced in 1983, and we finally abolished it about 2008 or thereabouts. Because actually we've got something better than carnet. You don't need a carnet. You don't need to commit to buying 10 tickets for which you have to use in a particular period of time, because you have pay as you go. You only pay for what you use, and it's priced appropriately. I mean, the reason why, just to be clear, the reason why Brussels offers a discount on carnets and Paris, and the reason why London offered a discount on carnets was nothing to do about giving you cheaper travel. It was the ability to sell 10 tickets at one time rather than one ticket each time, because there's a huge cost to ticketing. And frankly, all of that complexity arises, all of that sort of what looks very clever, but is actually not a very clever solution, arises because all you can do is sell paper tickets. And if you look at the flexi season that's been introduced on National Rail, that's a symptom of the same thing. You have to buy 8 tickets, which you have to use in 8 weeks. I mean, you have to make that commitment in advance, not knowing whether you're going to make 8 trips or not. And we have the system that says, you don't need to make that commitment. You only pay for what you use.
I mean, that's a good point for the commuter, but as a business, to have 10 tickets worth of revenue up front at the beginning of whatever period, surely there's a massive cash flow benefit.
Well, yes, but one of the very strong principles that we've upheld throughout in our fares and ticketing is charging people for doing silly things is never the right answer, right? Charging people for season tickets that they don't end up using, charging people for flexi seasons that they won't end up using, that is not the way to start charging people. The reason that we have such high trust in the system is because people feel they only get charged for what they use, there's transparency in the system, and so on. And I mean, I would say going back to a world in which we're creating friction of that kind is not the right answer at all.
Very helpful. So my colleague earlier referred to T-money, which are you familiar with that in Seoul? Obviously, that is pretty much like the Oyster card at its basic level, but it does have other advantages, such as it enables you to get discounts in certain stores and certain areas and certain services, but also the money that you load onto it, which is the same with Oyster, because Oyster is in the same way we were talking about cash flow. It puts money in the bank of TfL in advance, so you load your card with money. There are some retailers and some businesses that actually accept T-money as a transactional card as well. Is that not something we could look at, because that would obviously give us an advantage, and no doubt we could cream some commission off of any transactions?
So we did look at T-money. Actually, T-money didn't exist when we were looking at it, but the Octopus card in Hong Kong does something very similar, and we looked at that. We didn't go down that path for 3 reasons. One is that the regulations around e-money are very different in the UK and as it was back in Europe at that time. There's a much higher cost of compliance to e-money regulation here, which was not the case in Korea and Hong Kong. We're tied into a very complicated PFI agreement where equipment was expensive. And the third thing, which is really important, is that Hong Kong and Korea and Japan were very cash-dominated economies, whereas this was already a more advanced payment system running in the UK. And so we looked at the balance of, should we turn Oyster into an open payments card? And the economics of that was not great here because of the reasons I've just cited. And that's where we flipped the question on its head to say, actually, yes, there is the benefit of float and all that that comes in, but it's quite small compared to the convenience we have been able to offer. Because for all the beauty and the convenience of Hong Kong, try arriving in Hong Kong as a visitor, and you will find out how difficult it is. Or try arriving in Korea without T-money.
Well, but
the first thing you have to do is to figure out how to get a T-money card.
Yeah, well, the T-money card actually advertises it is the solution for visitors, and it also advertises the fact that you can buy it in different retailers.
Well, so Assembly Member Prince, the point that we don't even need to advertise is the point here. The fact that they need to advertise is they have to tell people, this is how you travel. We don't need to do it. We've given people the convenience. You don't need to do anything. Pick the product that's already in your pocket and you can travel.
I don't disagree with you on that either, but as you made that decision a long time ago, would it not be worth just revisiting it to see if there's any benefits in?
Well, we have revisited it several times, and I would say the business case for doing something with Oyster, turning it into an open payments card, is even weaker today than it used to be, because the whole world of micropayments is now on contactless.
Thank you. That's a very good answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask one quick question, just to finish off slightly, is The point that Assemblymember Prince made just then is a very good one, that when you bought a weekly travel card before and you put it in your wallet, you would, by the weekend, just be like, well, I'm going to use it because I've paid for it already, and it's free travel. It's essentially, you know, marginal cost of travel at the weekend was always free for people. And we do know that traffic is now up on the weekends. But also rail travel. Is TfL missing out on soft measures like people realising that they now have reached a cap? You don't have any way under contactless of notifying people you've reached your cap for the day? Why don't you keep going on public transport and never think about an Uber? Is that the sort of thing you might think about trying to bring into the system, or is it not possible for like privacy reasons?
No. I mean, so first thing is if you sign up. I mean, if you have our app. And by the way, TfL Go is going to get the payments capability into it soon as well. And so all of this capability, it'll become very visible to you.
That will be handy then.
Yeah, it'll become very visible to you when you've reached the cap. But I have to say that Londoners, by and large, understand. I mean, nobody understands capping, right? But Londoners, by and large, understand that if they travel a certain amount, they will reach a cap. And if you look at where the demand has been most buoyant on the transport system, it's on the weekends. Because people get this. People, you know, I mean...
Can we find out from you? I know there's tourists at the weekends as well, so it might get complicated. But are we able to find out from you how many people using transport at the weekends are already on their cap for the week? Or
yeah, I'm sure we can find that data.
Because it's very much a thing. I'm old school. I came to London in the 90s. A weekly travel card was very much, and you get your transport at the weekend for free. And so we were devoted public transport users at the weekend. And I'm not sure that Londoners quite have that.
Well, if anything, all the data will tell you is that Londoners are more dedicated to travel on the weekends now than they were back in the 1990s. In fact, the highest growth in
terms of mode share, you mean?
Yeah, well, not just in mode share, but in terms of real journeys on the underground. The highest growth of traffic on the underground has been in the evenings and weekends.
Yes, we know that, but also traffic. So this is the question, or is there more that we can do about that? Norman Baker, you're looking interested at this topic.
I'm looking interested. I was just going to observe that if you look at National Rail, then post-COVID, leisure journeys would come back very strongly indeed, and they're probably in many cases in excess of pre-COVID levels, which is an interesting development, I think, anyway. Whereas commuting traffic is actually still quite well down on where it was pre-COVID.
And you're talking about all different modes there, aren't you?
Talking about heavy rail in particular, but I think there's a general, I don't know, I mean, perhaps Shashi will know a bit more than me, but it seems to me people are prepared to travel in evenings and weekends more for leisure and for shopping, and for that matter as well, than they were perhaps before. And they're being more. And the flexible season tickets, of course, do help, but they're not the entire answer. The other thing I want to say about Oyster, by the way, just again to support Oyster, two things. One is I know when I reach my cap on Oyster, and I feel I've got a free journey at the end of the day from that. But also, you've got an Oyster, the ability to buy Oyster and stuff and top up in newsagent shops, in grocer shops and everything else. And that's terribly good, because in the big debate nationally about ticket offices, which we're starting to have, and we'll have even more shortly, you're presented with either a machine which doesn't offer you all the tickets you want, or a ticket office which is hardly ever open, or online which is not available to some people. So the idea you can go into a newsagent or wherever and buy your or top your Oyster is actually really good indeed. And why shouldn't you be able to buy a heavy rail ticket by going to shop and say, I'll have a return to Welland Garden City in a Mars bar, please? Why can't we do that?
Thank you very much. You do understand I was talking about the relative mode share for weekend journeys, not just demand for travel at weekends before, in terms of soft measures you might employ.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, I mean, I think that again, if you mean car versus public transport, do you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, the disincentive to cars, we haven't gone into this in great detail, but the disincentive to cars has to go hand in hand with the incentive of public transport. And if you look at those cities in the country, including London, but also thinking places like Brighton, which has done rather well at encouraging public transport use, and bus use is going up in Brighton. It's partly because it's unwelcome to travel by car, because the car parking is expensive, because there are bus lanes which get you A to B more quickly on a bus, because the traffic lights are phased to let buses through rather than cars. And we have to have, this is where the government, in my view, doesn't get it right. You have to have carrot and stick. It's no use just simply promoting public transport. You have to discourage car use at the same time. So I'm sorry that's slightly off your question, but I think it's an important point to make.
It is, yeah. And I think we'll feed back with a few more questions that come to us, to you, as we send you thank you letters as well, because we need you to draw to a close there. But thank you so much, everybody who's come as guests today, including Seb Dance, Deputy Mayor, earlier. It's been really, really interesting, and we'll try and work out what our feedback and outputs might be as a committee after this. The committee just has a couple more items of business to deal with, but if you need to leave the chamber, guests, that's fine. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion?
Noted.
Can we also delegate authority to meet as chair in consultation with the deputy chair and party group lead members to agree, and I do need to finish the sentences, I'm afraid, to agree any output arising from the meeting? Can we note the work programme and future meeting dates that are in the papers? We're next going to meet on the 28th of February here in the chamber, and there is no urgent business, so I can declare the meeting closed. Thank you. Yeah, I think if I just went, can we delegate